Attend, O reader, our tale of wonder. Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everybody. Last week we had ourselves a grand old time with some short stories that definitely got the VOD demonetized on YouTube. Um, but uh, we were really pushing the short story angle during October. There, it is now November as I record this and talk into the camera, and uh, uh, I want to go back to a full book. I was seeing what was what with some short stories. I had been, occasionally I go out and I look for books. I dig through, you know, bestseller lists and this and that and the other thing, suggested English class readings, and in the process, I had been finding a lot of short stories, and I was like, I have too many short stories stockpiled. I've been sitting on all these short stories in order to fill time after we finish full books, and I was like, I have too many short stories. We need to read these short stories. So that's what we were doing. Last week we had that Vonnegut short story. We had The Water Eater. The Water Eater was really fun. The Water Eater I might actually steal for a Monster of the Week campaign. But I digress. We had some great short stories there. It's now no longer spooky season. I'm feeling very spacefaring lately. Maybe it's all the James Webb Telescope stuff that's been coming out. Maybe I've just been in a very science fiction mood. Uh, I was talking to Raz about this the other day, and she and I do very similar things when it comes to science fiction. We kind of go through phases with it where, like, I'm reading a lot of fantasy, reading a lot of fantasy, I'm reading a lot of historical fiction, I'm reading a lot of, like, this, that, and the other thing. And then, so then when I finally get around to reading a science fiction novel again, I'm like, wow, space! And Raz does the same thing. Oh man, I am once again wishing I could get a hold of authors a little easier because I've been reading a lot of paper books lately. Which feels weird. I'm so used to these ebooks now. But I've been reading a lot of paper books lately. I've been indisposed away from screens, and so that leaves me with paper books. I've been reading a lot of paper books. I've read some really, really great short science fiction while I was away from the camera, and it was just a lot of them. I really wish I could get a hold of somebody and be like, "Can I read this? Can I read this on my internet show, please?" Uh, but I don't know. Like I said, I've been in a very science fiction mood lately. I've been in a very Sword and Planet mood for this whole season of Paper Cuts, really. And fittingly, in that tradition, we're in that tradition of Sword and Planet. Space conqueror, space colonizer guy. We're gonna lean in and we're gonna read A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Edgar Rice Burroughs, for context, is the guy who did Tarzan. You are hearing that name correctly. I may eventually get around to Tarzan of the Apes. I don't know. I think, if I may be blunt, I like Sword and Planet because it has its narrative shortcomings set off to some degree by the fact that it's in space. Uh, we'll see how I like this. I'll say that. If I really, really like this, there's an entire series of these that I may eventually get to. But if I really, really like this, I might pick up the first Tarzan book, Tarzan of the Apes. We'll see. Uh, but also, there is an entire, like, 10, 15, 20 book series for these. So if I really like this, we've got a lot of books to sprinkle in the future. But let's dive in, shall we? He dedicates the book to his son, Jack. And there is immediately a foreword. To the reader of this book, in submitting Captain Carter's strange manuscript to you in book form, I believe that a few words relative to this remarkable personality would be of interest. My first recollection of Captain Carter is of the few months he spent at my father's home in Virginia just prior to the opening of the Civil War. I was then a child of but 5 years, yet I well remember the tall, dark, smooth-faced, athletic man whom I called Uncle Jack. He seemed always to be laughing, and he entered into the sports of the children with the same hearty good fellowship he displayed toward those pastimes in which the men and women of his own age indulged. Or he would sit for an hour at a time entertaining my old grandmother with stories of his strange, wild life in all parts of the world. We all loved him, and our slaves fairly worshipped the ground he trod. Yeah, shocker. This is a Civil War narrative. The Civil War narrative is kind of a framing device, but keep in mind, Burroughs is intentionally writing this character from a Civil War perspective as a Southern soldier. So please keep that in mind. That is your blanket content warning for this book. Be in the right mood for this, I will say. As I point out in the notes down on Twitch, which I should probably start pasting into the show notes for paper cuts, I do give a blanket warning. These books are in the public domain. They're going to contain things that make you or I cringe every now and again, but they are worth showing the world. Still, they've been saved for a reason. They've been remembered for a reason. And I do my level best to give you all heads up on stuff when I know what to give you heads up on, because I feel you're entitled to that warning. But you are you the viewer, you the listener, are the person who needs to take that information and do with it what you will. I will try not to inject too much of my modern eyeballs onto the story. But if you're watching the video, you may see me make faces when I have to say certain words. Anyway, I digress. He was a splendid specimen of manhood, standing a good 2 inches over 6 feet. Broad of shoulder and narrow of hip, with the carriage of a trained fighting man. Sorry, I'm going to bump up the font size a little bit because I'm blind. His features were regular and clear-cut, his hair black and closely cropped, while his eyes were of a steel gray, reflecting a strong and loyal character filled with fire and initiative. His manners were perfect, and his courtliness was that of a typical Southern gentleman of the highest type. His horsemanship, especially after hounds, was a marvel and delight, even in that country of magnificent horsemen. I've heard often that my father was cautioning him against his wild recklessness, but he'd only laugh and say that the tumble that killed him would be from the back of a horse yet on foal. When the war did break out, he left us, and not did I see him again for some 15 or 16 years. When he returned, it was without warning, and I was much surprised to note that he had not aged apparently a moment, nor had he changed in any other outward way. He was, when others were with him, the same genial, happy fellow we had known of old, but when he thought himself alone, I've seen him sit for hours gazing off into space, his face set in a look of wistful longing and hopeless misery. And at night he would sit thus, looking up into the heavens, at what I did not know until I read his manuscripts years after. He told us that he had been prospecting and mining in Arizona part of the time since the war, and that he'd been very successful. That was evidenced by the unlimited amount of money which he was now supplies. As to the details of his life during these years, he was very recipient. In fact, he wouldn't talk to them at all. He remained with us for about a year and then went to New York, where he purchased a little place on the Hudson, and I visited him once a year on the occasion of my trips to the New York market, my father and I owning and operating a string of general stores throughout Virginia at that time. Captain Carter had a small but beautiful cottage situated on a bluff overlooking the river, and during one of my last visits in the winter of 1885, I observed he was much preoccupied in writing, I presume now, upon this manuscript. He told me at this time that if anything should happen to him, he wished me to take charge of his estate, and he gave me a key to a compartment in the safe which stood in his study, telling me that I would find his will there and some personal instructions which he had me pledge myself to carry out with absolute fidelity. After I had retired for the night, I've seen him from my window, standing in the moonlight on the brink of the bluff overlooking the Hudson, with his arms stretched out to the heavens as though in an appeal. I thought at that time that he was praying, although I never understood that he was, in the strict sense of the term, a religious man. Several months after I'd returned home from my last visit, the 1st of March, 1886, I think, I received a telegram from him asking me to come to him at once. I had always been his favorite among the younger generation of Carters, and so I hastened to comply with his demand. I arrived at the little station about a mile from his grounds on the morning of March 4th, 1886, and when I asked the liveryman to drive me out to Captain Carter's, he replied that if I was a friend of the captain's, he had some very bad news for me. The captain had been found dead, shortly after daylight, that very morning by the watchman attached to an adjoining property. For some reason, this news didn't surprise me, but I hurried out to the place as quickly as possible so that I could take charge of the body and of his affairs. I found the watchman who had discovered him, together with local police chief and several townspeople, assembled in his little study. The watchman related the few details connected with the finding of the body, which he said had been still warm when he came upon it. It lay, he said, stretched full length in the snow, with the arms outstretched above the head, toward the edge of the bluff, and when he showed me the spot, it flashed upon me that it was the identical one where I'd seen him on those other nights, with his arms raised in supplication to the sky. There were no marks of violence on the body, and with the aid of a local physician, the coroner's jury quickly reached a decision of death from heart failure. Left alone in the study, I opened the safe and withdrew the contents of the drawer which he had told me I'd find by instructions. They were in part peculiar indeed, but I followed them to the last detail as faithfully as I was able. He directed that I remove his body to Virginia without an embalmment, and he was to be laid in an open coffin within a tomb he had previously had constructed, and which, as I later learned, was well ventilated. The instructions impressed upon me that I must personally see that this was carried out just as he directed, even in secrecy if necessary. His property was left in such a way that I was to receive the entire income for 25 years, when the principal was to become mine. His further instructions related to this manuscript, which I was to retain, sealed and unread, just as I'd found it, for 11 more years, nor was I to divulge its contents until 21 years after his death. A strange feature about his tomb, where the body still lies, is that the massive door is equipped with a single, huge, gold-plated spring lock, which can be opened only from the inside. Yours very sincerely, Edgar Rice Burroughs. That's one heck of an opening. So he has built himself a massive tomb with a spring-loaded lock that can only be opened from the inside. He was found dead, his arms raised as though he was pleading with the sky. And this manuscript, which has been released now 21 years after his death, which would be 1900 and... Well, he said 1886, and they said 21 years, so it'd be 1907 numbers. Did he say 1886? Did he say 21 years? 21 years after his death, and that occurred in 1886. Yeah, so 1907. I wonder when was this originally released? That's a good question. Let's ask Google real quick before we dive into the next chapter. Princess of Mars release. The Princess of Mars is a science fantasy novel by Edgar Rice Burroughs, the first of a series, in 1912. A classic example of pulp fiction, planetary romance, as we all know. It was originally titled Under the Moons of Mars, which is A really great title. I don't know why they went away from that. Yeah, published it was serialized in 1912 and republished in 1917 as a hardcover. So unless I've done my math wrong, there's an extra 10 years there. It is followed. It is followed by a great deal of other books. Let's ask the internet here. 10 sequels over the next 30 years were published by Burroughs. So we've got 10 more of these if I like this. There's also a very lovely, like, airbrushed fantasy novel cover for this thing that I did not get in this copy. Anyway, let's dive into chapter 1 on the Arizona hills. I'm a very old man. How old, I do not know. Possibly I'm 100, possibly more, but I cannot tell because I've never aged as other men, nor do I remember any childhood. So far as I can recollect, I have always been a man of about 30. I appear today as I did 40 years and more ago, yet I feel that I cannot go on living forever, that someday I shall die the real death from which there is no resurrection. I do not know why I should fear death, I who have died twice and am still alive, but yet I have the same horror of it as those who have never died, and it is because of this terror of death, I believe, that I am so convinced of my mortality. And because of this conviction, I have determined to write down the story of the interesting periods of my life and of my death. I cannot explain the phenomena. I can only set down here, in the words of an ordinary soldier of fortune, a chronicle of the strange events that befell me during the 10 years that my dead body lay undiscovered in an Arizona cave. I have never told this story, nor shall mortal man see this manuscript until I have passed over for eternity. I know that the average human mind will not believe what it cannot grasp, and so I do not propose being pilloried by the public, the pulpit, and the press, and held up as a colossal liar when I am but telling some simple truths, which someday science will substantiate. Possibly the suggestions which I gained upon Mars and his knowledge that's been set down in this chronicle will aid in an earlier understanding of the mysteries of our sister planet. Mysteries to you, but no longer mysteries to me. My name is John Carter. I am better known as Captain Jack Carter of Virginia. At the close of the Civil War, I found myself possessed of several $100,000 in Confederate money, and the captain's commission in the cavalry arm of an army which no longer existed, the servant of a state which had vanished with the hopes of the South. Masterless, penniless, and with my only means of livelihood fighting, gone, I determined to work my way to the southwest and attempt to retrieve my fallen fortunes in search for gold. I spent nearly a year prospecting in company with another Confederate officer, Captain James K. Powell of Richmond. We were extremely fortunate, for late in the winter of 1865, after many hardships and privations, we located the most remarkable gold-bearing quartz vein that our wildest dreams had ever pictured. Powell, who was a mining engineer by education, stated that we'd uncovered over $1 million worth of ore in a trifle over 3 months. As our equipment was crude in the extreme, we decided that one of us must return to civilization, purchase the necessary machinery, and return with a sufficient force of men properly to work the mine. As Powell was familiar with the country as well as with the mechanical requirements of mining, we determined that it would be best for him to make the trip. It was agreed that I was to hold down our claim against the remote possibility of being jumped by some wandering prospector. On March 3rd, 1866, Powell and I practiced provisions on 2 of our burros, and bidding me goodbye, he mounted his horse and started down the mountainside toward the valley, across which led the first stage of his journey. The morning of Powell's departure was, like nearly all Arizona mornings, clear and beautiful. I could see him and his little pack animals picking their way down the mountainside toward the valley, and all during the morning I would catch occasional glimpses of them as they toppled a bog back or came out upon a level plateau. My last sight of Powell was about 3 in the afternoon as he entered the shadows of the range on the opposite side of the valley. Some half hour later, I happened to glance casually across the valley and was much surprised to note 3 little dots in about the same place that I had last seen my friend and his 2 pack animals. I am not given to needless worrying, but the more I tried to convince myself that all was well with Powell, and that the dots I had seen on his trail were antelope or wild horses, the less I was able to assure myself. Since we had entered the territory, we had not seen a hostile Indian, and we had, therefore, become careless in the extreme, and were wont to ridicule the stories we'd heard of the great numbers of these vicious marauders that were supposed to haunt the trails, taking their toll in lives and torture of every white party which fell into their merciless clutches. Powell, I knew, was well armed, and further an experienced Indian fighter, but I too had lived and fought for years among the Sioux in the north, and I knew that his chances were small against a party of cunning, trailing Apaches. Finally, I could endure the suspense no longer, and arming myself with 2 Colt revolvers and a carbine, I strapped 2 belts of cartridges about me, and catching my saddle horse, started down the trail taken by Powell in the morning. As soon as I reached comparatively level ground, as soon as I reached comparatively level ground, I urged my mount into a canter and continued this, where the going permitted, until close upon dusk I discovered the point where the other tracks joined those of Powell. They were the tracks of unshod ponies, 3 of them, and the ponies had been galloping. I followed rapidly until, darkness shutting down, I was forced to await the rising of the moon, and given an opportunity to speculate on the questionable wisdom of my chase. Possibly I'd conjured up an impossible danger, like some nervous old housewife. When I should catch up with Powell, I'd get a good laugh for my pains. However, I'm not prone to sensitiveness, and the following of a sense of duty, wherever it may lead, has always been a kind of fetish with me throughout my life, which may account for the honors bestowed upon me by 3 republics and the decorations and friendships of an old and powerful emperor and several lesser kings, in whose service my sword has been read many a time. About 9 o'clock the moon was sufficiently bright for me to proceed on my way, and I had no difficulty in following the trail at a fast walk, and in some places at a brisk trot, until about midnight, when I had reached the water hole where Powell had expected to camp. I came upon the spot unexpectedly, finding it entirely deserted, with no signs of having been recently occupied as a camp. I was interested to note that the tracks of the pursuing horsemen, for such I was now convinced they must be, continued after Powell with only a brief stop at the hole for water, and always at the same rate of speed as his. I was positive now that the trailers were Apaches, that they wished to capture Powell alive for the fiendish pleasure of that torture, so I urged my horse onward at a most dangerous pace, hoping against hope that I could catch up with the red rascals before they attacked him. Further speculation was suddenly cut short by the faint report of 2 shots far ahead of me. I knew that Powell would need me now, if ever, and I instantly urged my horse to his topmost speed up the narrow and difficult mountain trail. I had forged ahead for perhaps a mile or more, without hearing further sounds, when the trail suddenly debouched. When the trail suddenly debouched onto a small, open plateau near the summit of the pass. I had passed through a narrow, overhanging gorge just before entering suddenly upon this tableland, and the sight which met my eyes filled me with consternation and dismay. The little stretch of level land was white with Indian teepees, and there were probably 1,000 red warriors clustered around some object near the center of the camp. Their attention was so wholly riveted to this point of interest that they did not so wholly riveted to this point of interest that they did not notice me, and I easily could have turned back into the dark recesses of this gorge and made my escape with perfect safety. The fact, however, that this thought didn't occur to me until the following day removes any possible right to a claim of heroism to which the narration of this episode might possibly otherwise entitle me. I do not believe that I am made of the stuff which constitutes heroes, because in all the hundreds of instances that my voluntary acts have placed me face to face with death, I cannot recall a single one where any alternative step to that I took occurred to me until many hours later. My mind is evidently so constituted that I'm subconsciously forced in the path of duty without recourse to tiresome mental processes. However that may be, I have never regretted that cowardice is not optional with me. In this instance, I was, of course, positive that Powell was the center of attraction, but whether I thought or acted first, I do not know. But within an instant from the moment the scene broke upon my view, I'd whipped out my revolvers and was charging down upon the entire army of warriors, shooting rapidly and whooping at the top of my lungs. Single-handedly, I could not have pursued better tactics, for the red men, convinced by sudden surprise that not less than a regiment of regulars were upon them, turned and fled in every direction for their bows, arrows, and rifles. The view which their hurried routing disclosed filled me with apprehension and with rage. Under the clear rays of the Arizona moon lay Powell, his body fairly bristling with the hostile arrows of those braves. That he was already dead I could not but be convinced, and yet I would have saved his body from mutilation at the hands of the Apaches as quickly as I would have saved the man himself from death. Riding close to him, I reached down from the saddle and, grasping his cartridge belt, threw him up across the withers of my mount. A backward glance convinced me that to return by the way I had come would be more hazardous than to continue across the plateau, so, putting spurs to my poor beast, I made a dash for the opening to the pass which I could distinguish on the far side of the tableland. The Indians had by this time discovered that I was alone, and I was pursued with imprecations, arrows, and rifle balls. The fact that it is difficult to aim anything but imprecations accurately by moonlight certainly that they were, or rather, let me fumbled the page turn there, sorry. The fact that it is difficult to aim anything but imprecations accurately by moonlight, that they were upset by the sudden and unexpected manner of my advent, and that I was a rather rapidly moving target, saved me from the various deadly projectiles of the enemy, and permitted me to reach the shadows of the surrounding peaks before an orderly pursuit could be organized. My horse was traveling practically unguided, as I knew that I'd probably less knowledge to the exact location of the trail in the pass than he, and thus it happened that he entered a defile, which led to the summit of the range, and not to the pass which I had hoped would carry me to the valley and to safety. It is probable, however, to this fact that I owe my life, and the remarkable experiences and adventures which befell me during the next following 10 years. My first knowledge that I was on the wrong trail came when I heard the yells of the pursuing savages suddenly grow fainter and fainter far off to my left. I knew then that they had passed to the left of the jagged rock formation, the edge of the plateau, to the right of which my horse had borne me and the body of Powell. I drew rein on a little level promontory overlooking the trail below, and to my left I saw the party of pursuing savages disappearing around the point of a neighboring peak. I knew the Indians would soon discover they were on the wrong trail, and the search for me would be renewed in the right direction as soon as they located my tracks. I had gone but a short distance further when what seemed to be an excellent trail opened up around the face of a high cliff. The trail was level and quite broad, led upward and in the general direction I wished to go. The cliff arose for 700 feet on my right, and on my left was an equal and nearly perpendicular drop to the bottom of a rocky ravine. I followed this trail for perhaps 100 yards, when a sharp turn to the right brought me to the mouth of a large cave. The opening was about 4 feet in height and 3 to 4 feet wide, and at this opening the trail ended. It was now morning, and with the customary lack of dawn, which is a startling characteristic of Arizona, it had become daylight almost without warning. Dismounting, I laid Powell upon the ground, but the most painstaking examination failed to reveal the faintest spark of life. I forced water from my canteen between his dead lips, bathed his face, and rubbed his hands, working them over continuously for the better part of an hour, in the face of the fact that I knew him to be dead. I was very fond of Powell. He was thoroughly a man in every respect, a polished Southern gentleman, a staunch and true friend, and it was with the feeling of the deepest grief that I finally gave up my crude endeavors at resuscitation. Leaving Powell's body where it lay on the ledge, I crept into the cave to reconnoiter. I just found a large chamber, possibly 100 feet in diameter, 30 or 40 feet in length. It had a well-worn, smooth floor, and many other evidences that the cave had, at some remote period, been inhabited. The back of the cave was so lost in dense shadow that I could not distinguish whether there were openings into other apartments or not. As I was continuing my examination, I commenced to feel a pleasant drowsiness creeping over me, which I attributed to the fatigue of my long and strenuous ride. The reaction from the excitement of the fight and the pursuit. I felt comparatively safe in my present location, as I knew that one man could defend the trail to the cave against an army. I soon became so drowsy that I could scarcely resist the strong desire to throw myself on the floor of the cave for a few moments' rest. But I knew that this would never do, as it would mean certain death at the hands of my red friends, who might be upon me at any moment. With an effort, I started toward the opening of the cave, only to reel drunkenly against the side wall, and from there slip prone along the floor. Sorry, this rain is making me sleepy. Hang on, let me fiddle some settings so you all can hear the rain properly, shall we? Oh, isn't that lovely? Lovely little rain sounds. Anyway, I want to get up and stretch, but I have a very comfortable cat on my lap, so that won't do. Let's dive into chapter 2. The Escape of the Dead. A sense of delicious dreaminess overcame me. My muscles relaxed, and I was on the point of giving way to my desire to sleep when the sound of approaching horses reached my ears. You're about to give in your desire to sleep too, kitty. I attempted to spring to my feet, but was horrified to discover that my muscles... What about your muscles? That's paid by me. I was horrified to discover that my muscles refused to respond to my will. I was now thoroughly awake, but as unable to move a muscle as though turned to stone. It was then, for the first time, that I noticed a slight vapor filling the cave. It was extremely tenuous and only noticeable against the opening which led to daylight. There also came to my nostrils a fairly pungent odor, and I could only assume that I had been overcome by some poisonous gas. But why I should retain my mental faculties, and yet be unable to move, I could not fathom. I lay facing the opening of the cave, and where I could see the short stretch of trail which lay between the cave and the turn of the cliff around which the trail led. The noise of the approaching horses had ceased, and I judged the Indians were creeping stealthily along the little land. I judged the Indians were creeping stealthily upon me along the little ledge which led to my living tomb. I remember that I hoped they would make short work of me, as I did not particularly relish the thought of the innumerable things they might do to me if the spirit prompted them. I had not long to wait before a stealthy sound apprised me of their nearness, and then a war-bonneted, paint-streaked face was thrust cautiously around the shoulder of the cliff, and savage eyes looked into mine. That he could see me in the dim light of the cave I was sure, for the early morning sun was falling full upon me through the opening. The fellow, instead of approaching, merely stood and stared, his eyes bulging, his jaw dropped. Then another savage face appeared, and a third, and a fourth, and a fifth, craning their necks over the shoulders of their fellows when they could not pass upon the narrow ledge. Each face was the picture of awe and fear, but for what reason I did not know, nor did I learn until 10 years later. That there were still other braves behind those who regarded me was apparent from the fact that the leaders passed back whispered word to those behind them. Suddenly a low but distinct moaning sound issued from the recesses of the cave behind me, and as it reached the ears of the Indians they turned and fled in terror, panic-stricken. So frantic were their efforts to escape from the unseen thing behind me that one of the braves was hurled headlong from the cliff to the rocks below. Their wild cries echoed in the canyon for a short time, and then all was still once more. The sound which had frightened them was not repeated, but it had been sufficient as it was to start me, speculating on that possible horror which lurked in the shadows at my back. Fear is a relative term, so I can only measure my feelings at that time, what I had experienced in previous positions of danger, and those I've passed through since, but I can say without shame that if the sensations I endured during the next few minutes were fear, then may God help the coward, for cowardice is of surety its own punishment. To be held paralyzed with one's back towards some horrible and unknown danger from the very sound of which the ferocious Apache warriors turn in a wild stampede, as a flock of sheep would flee from a pack of wolves, seems to me the last word in fearsome predicaments. Rather seems to me to be the last word in fearsome predicaments for a man who had ever been used to fighting for his life with all the energy of a powerful physique. Several times I thought I had heard a faint sound behind me as of somebody moving cautiously, but eventually even those ceased. I was left to the contemplation of my position without interruption. I could not but vaguely conjecture the cause of my paralysis, and my only hope lay in that it might suddenly pass off as it had fallen upon me. Ooh. Sorry, it's not the only thing falling upon John Carter here. I, the narrator, am having a horrible sense of drowsiness falling upon me. Late in the afternoon, my horse, which had been standing with dragging rein before the cave, started slowly down the trail, evidently in search of food and water, and I was left alone with my mysterious unknown companion and the dead body of my friend, which lay just within my range of vision, upon the ledge where I had placed it in the early morning. From then until possibly midnight, all was silence, silence of the dead. And then suddenly, the awful moan of the morning broke upon my startled ears. There came again from the black shadows the sound of a moving thing, and a faint rustling as of dead leaves. The shock to my already overstrained nervous system was terrible in the extreme. With a superhuman effort, I strove to break my awful bonds. It was an effort of the mind, of the will, of the nerves, not muscular, for I could not move even so much as my little finger, but none the less mighty for all that. Then something gave, some momentary feeling of nausea, and a sharp click of the snapping of a steel wire. I stood with my back against the wall of the cave, facing the unknown foe. Then the moonlight flooded the cave, and there before me lay my own body, as it had been lying all those hours, with the hands staring toward with the eyes staring toward the open ledge, and the hands resting limply upon the ground. I looked first at my lifeless clay down there upon the floor, and then down at myself in utter bewilderment, for there I lay clothed, yet here I stood, butt naked, as the minute of my birth. The transition had been so sudden and so unexpected it left me for a moment forgetful of aught else, and my strange metamorphosis. First thought was, escape? I indeed passed over into the other life? But I could not well believe it, as I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs even. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs from the exertion of my efforts to release myself from the anesthesis which held me. My breath was coming in quick. Short gasps, cold sweat stood out from every pore of my body, and the ancient experiment of pinching revealed that I was anything other than a wraith. Again, I was suddenly recalled to my immediate surroundings by a repetition of that strange moan from the depths of the cave. Naked and unarmed as I was, I had no desire to face the unseen thing that menaced me. My revolvers were strapped to my lifeless body, which, for some unfathomable reason, I could not bring myself to touch. My carbine was in its boot, strapped to its saddle, and as my horse had wandered off, I was left without means of defense. My only alternative seemed to be in flight. My decision was being crystallized by a reoccurrence of this rustling sound, the thing that now seemed, in the darkness of space, and to my distorted imagination, to be creeping stealthily upon me. Sorry, I'm trying very hard not to be too sleepy. I did have a long week, so we may not get too far into this. Or I need to just turn on a few more lights. I don't have a lot of lights on in here, and that might be what's making me sleepy. Let me adjust that and see if it helps. If anything, I could take the intermission to make some tea. And that's a little better. Be awake. Yeah, be awake, says librarian. Where was it? Unable any longer to resist the temptation to escape this horrible place, I leapt quickly through the opening into the starlight of a clear Arizona night. The crisp, fresh mountain air outside the cave acted as an immediate tonic, and I felt new life and new courage coursing through me. Pausing upon the brink of the ledge, I upbraided myself for what now seemed to me wholly unwarranted apprehension. I reasoned with myself that I'd lain helpless for many hours within the cave, that nothing bad molested me. My better judgment, when permitted the direction of clear and logical reasoning, convinced me that the noises I had heard must have resulted from purely natural and harmless causes. Probably the conformation of the rock was such that a slight breeze caused the sounds I heard. I decided to investigate, but first I lifted my head to fill my lungs with the pure, invigorating night air of the mountains. As I did so, I saw stretching far below me the beautiful vista of the rocky gorge and level, cacti-studded flat, wrought by the moonlight into a miracle of soft splendor and wondrous enchantment. Few Western wonders are more inspiring than the beauties of an Arizona moonlit landscape, the silvered mountains in the distance, the strange lights and shadows upon hogback and arroyo, and the grotesque details of the stiff yet beautiful cacti form a picture more enchanting and inspiring than one would expect, as though one were catching for the first time a glimpse of some dead and forgotten world, so different it is from any aspect of any other spot upon our earth. As I stood thus meditating, I turned my gaze from the landscape to the heavens, where the myriad stars formed a gorgeous and fitting canopy for the wonders of the earthly scene. My attention was quickly riveted by a large red star close to the distant horizon. As I gazed upon it, I felt a spell of overpowering fascination. It was Mars, the god of war, and for me, the fighting man, that had always held the power of an irresistible enchantment. As I gazed on it on that far-gone night, it seemed to call to me across the unthinkable void, to lure me to it, to draw me as the lodestone attracts a particle of iron. My longing was beyond the power of opposition. I closed my eyes, stretched out my arms toward the god of my vocation, and felt myself drawn, with a suddenness of thought, through a trackless immensity of space. There was an instant of extreme cold and utter darkness. And then we move to chapter 3, my advent on Mars. I opened my eyes upon a strange and weird landscape. I knew that I was on Mars. Not once did I question either my sanity or my wakefulness. I was not asleep. No need for pinching here. My inner consciousness told me as plainly that I was upon Mars as your conscious mind tells you that you're upon Earth. You didn't question the fact, neither did I. Found myself lying prone upon a bed of yellowish, moss-like vegetation, which stretched around me in all directions for interminable miles. I seemed to be lying in a deep, circular basin, along the outer edge of which could distinguish the irregularities of a few low hills. It was midday. The sun was shining full upon me, and the heat of it was rather intense upon my naked body, yet no other would have been true, but no greater, rather, than what would have been under similar conditions on an Arizona desert. Here and there were slight outcroppings of quartz and rock, which you can see in the sunlight, and a little to my left, perhaps 100 yards above, where appeared a low-walled computer, or a low-walled enclosure set about 4 feet in height. No water, and no other vegetation. The moss was evidence as I was somewhat thirsty. I decided to do a little exploring. Springing to my feet, I received my first Martian surprise for the effort, which on Earth, which would have brought me standing upright, it carried me into the Martian air to the height of about 3 yards. I alighted softly upon the ground, however, without appreciable shock or jar. Now commenced a series of evolutions, which even then seemed ludicrous in the extreme. I found that I must learn to walk all over again, as the muscular exertion which carried me easily and softly upon earth played strange antics with me upon Mars. Instead of progressing me in a sane and dignified manner, my attempts to walk resulted in a variety of hops, which took me clear of the ground a couple of feet at each step, and landed me sprawling upon my face, or back at the end of each second or third hop. My muscles, perfectly attuned and accustomed to the force of gravity on Earth, played the mischief with me, in attempting for the first time to cope with lesser gravitation and lower air pressure on Mars. I was determined, however, to explore the low structure, which was the only evidence of habitation in sight, and so I hit upon the unique plan of reverting to first principles in locomotion, that is, creeping. I did fairly well at this, and in a few moments I had reached the low encircling wall of the enclosure. There appeared to be no doors or windows upon the side nearest me, but the wall was about 4 feet high. I continuously gained my feet and peered over the top to have the strangest sight that I had ever been given to see. The roof of the enclosure was of solid glass about 4 or 5 inches in thickness, and beneath this were several hundred large eggs, perfectly round and snowy white. The eggs were nearly uniform in size, being about 2½ feet in diameter. 5 or 6 had already hatched, and the grotesque caricatures which sat blinking in the sunlight were enough to cause me to doubt my sanity. They seemed mostly head, with little scrawny bodies and long necks. Long necks and 6 legs, or as I learned afterward, 2 legs and 2 arms with an intermediary pair of limbs which were to be used at will as either arm. Sorry, I'm trying to picture what is being described here. Let me read that again in case you all missed it. 5 or 6 had already hatched, and the grotesque caricatures which sat blinking in the sunlight were enough to cause me to doubt my sanity. They seemed mostly heads, little scrawny bodies, long necks, and 6 legs, or, as I afterward learned, 2 legs and 2 arms with an intermediary pair of limbs which could be used at will as either legs or arms. Their eyes were set at the extreme sides of their heads, and a trifle above the center, and protruded in such a manner that they could be directed either forward or back, and also independently of each other, and thus permitting the strange animal to look in any direction, or in two directions at once, without the necessity of turning their head. The ears, which were slightly above the eyes, and closer together, were small cup-shaped antennae, protruding not more than an inch from these young specimens. Their noses were but longitudinal slits in the center of their faces, midway between their mouths and ears. There was no hair on their bodies, which were of a very light yellowish-green color. In adults, as I was to learn quite soon, darker. In the adults, as I was to learn quite soon, this color deepens to an olive green and is darker in the male than in the female. Further, the heads of the adults are not so far. Further, the heads of the adults are not so far out of proportion to their young bodies as in the case of the young. The iris of the eye is blood red, as the albinos are, while the pupil remains dark. The eyeball itself is very white as teeth. The latter add a most ferocious appearance to an otherwise fierce, terrible countenance. And the lower trunks curve upward. As the lower trunks curve upward to the sharp point and about where the eyes of earthly human beings are located. The whiteness of the teeth is not ivory, but of the snowiest and most gleaming of china. Against the most of these details I noted later, for I was given but little time to speculate on the wonders of my new discovery. I had seen that the eggs were in the process of hatching. As I stood watching the hideous little monsters break from their shells, I failed to note the approach of a score of full-grown Martians from behind me. As I said, me trailing off here is occasionally me occasionally losing my place, losing my thought, occasionally just being very sleepy. This rain, like I said, rain makes me sleepy. You know, normally during the day, when it's like raining and kind of misty and kind of gloomy, you know, obviously I have that kind of nesting instinct. You know, you want to burrow down in the blankets and be comfy. But also, I'm the type of person where it's like, oh, it's a horrible day out. I want to go out on the town and do things because nobody else wants to go. So it's a fun time for it. But now that it's night and it's raining, I'm just sitting here reading, and I'm like, sleep. No. I closed my phone. I needed to keep an eye on chat. Tell you what, gang. I want to stand for a little bit so this rain doesn't make me quite so sleepy. Because Carter here is about to get jumped, purportedly, by these Martian types. Stretched out a little bit. Where was it? I failed to note the approach of a score of full-grown Martians from behind me. That's where we were. Coming as they did over the soft and soundless moss, which covers practically the entire surface of Mars, with the exception of the frozen areas, the poles, and the scattered cultivated districts, they might have captured me more easily, but their intentions were far more sinister. It was the rattling of their accoutrements, the foremost warrior, that warned me. On such a little thing my life hung that I often marvel that I escaped so easily. Had not the rifle of the leader of the party swung from its fastening behind his saddle in such a way as to strike against the butt of his great metal-shod spear, I should have snuffed out without ever knowing that death was near me. But that little sound caused me to turn, and there upon me, not 10 feet from my chest, was the point of that huge spear, a spear 40 feet long, tipped with a gleaming metal, and held low at the side of a mounted replica of the little devils I'd been watching. But how puny and harmless they now looked beside this huge and terrific incarnation of hate and of vengeance and of death. The man himself, or as such I may call him, was fully 15 feet in height, and on earth would have weighed some 400 pounds. He sat his mount as we sit a horse, grasping the animal's barrel with his lower limbs, while the hands of his two right arms held his immense spear low at the side of his mount. His two left arms were outstretched laterally to help preserve his balance, the thing he rode, having neither bridle nor reins of any description or guidance. Library. God, I'm actively trying to pet you. You know, it's easier for me to pet you when you're not attacking the hand that's trying to get you. Did you know that? I hope you all could just see Library doing that. Anyway. Yeah! And his mount. How can earthly words describe it? It towered 10 feet at the shoulder, had 4 legs on either side, a broad, flat tail, larger at the tip than at the root, and which it held straight out from behind while running, a gaping mouth which split its head from its snout to its long, massive neck. Like its master, it was entirely devoid of hair, but it was of a dark slate color, and exceedingly smooth and glossy. Its belly was white, and its legs shaded from the slate of its shoulders and hips to a vivid yellow at the feet. The feet themselves were heavily padded and nailless, which in fact had also contributed to the noiselessness of their approach, and in common with a multiplicity of legs is a characteristic feature of the fauna of Mars. The highest type of man and one other animal, the only mammal existing on Mars, alone have well-formed nails. There are absolutely no hooved animals in existence there. Behind this first charging demon trailed 19 others, similar in all respects, but, as I learned later, bearing individual characteristics peculiar to themselves, precisely as no 2 of us are identical, even though we're all cast in a similar mold. This picture, or rather materialized nightmare, which I have described at length, made but one terrible and swift impression on me as I turned to meet it. Unarmed and naked as I was, the first law of nature manifested itself in the only possible solution of my immediate problem, that was to get out of the vicinity of the point of the charging spear. Consequently, I gave a very earthly and at the same time superhuman leap to reach the top of the Martian incubator, for such I had determined it must be. My effort was crowned with a success which appalled me no less than it seemed to surprise the Martian warriors, for it carried me fully 30 feet into the air, landed me 100 feet from my pursuers, and on the opposite side of the enclosure. I alighted upon the soft moss easily and without mishap, and turning, saw my enemies lined up along the further wall. Some were surveying me with expressions which I afterward discovered marked extreme astonishment, and the others were evidently satisfying themselves that I had not molested their young in any way. They were conversing together in low tones, gesticulating and pointing toward me. Their discovery that I had not harmed the little Martians, that I was unarmed, must have caused them to look upon me with less ferocity, but, as I was to learn later, the thing which weighed most in my favor was my exhibition of hurdling. While the Martians are immense, their bones are very large, and they muscled only in proportion to the gravity which they must overcome. The result is that they are infinitely less agile and less powerful, in proportion to their weight anyway, than an Earthman, and I doubt that were one of them transported suddenly to Earth that he could lift his very own weight from the ground. In fact, I'm convinced that he could not do so. My feat, then, was as marvelous upon Mars as it would have been upon Earth, and from desiring to annihilate me, they suddenly looked upon me as a wonderful discovery to be captured and exhibited among their fellows. The respite my unexpected agility had given me permitted me to formulate plans for the immediate future, and to note more closely the appearance of the warriors, for I could not disassociate these people in my mind from those other warriors who, only the day before, had been pursuing me. I noted that each was armed with several other weapons, in addition to the huge spear which I had described. The weapon which caused me to decide against an attempt at escape by flight was what was evidently a rifle of some description, which I felt, for some reason, they were peculiarly efficient in handling. These rifles were of a white metal stock of wood, which I learned later was a very light and intensely hard growth, much prized on Mars, and evidently entirely unknown to us denizens of Earth. The metal of the barrel is an alloy composed principally of aluminum and steel, which they've learned to temper to a hardness far exceeding that of the steel with which we're familiar. The weight of these rifles is comparatively little, and with the small caliber, explosive, radium projectiles they use, and the great length of the barrel, they are deadly in the extreme, at ranges which would be unthinkable on Earth. The theoretic effective radius of this rifle is 300 miles, but the best they can do in actual service, when equipped with their wireless finders and sighters, is but a trifle over 200 miles. Okay, two things. First of all, the mention of aluminum steel alloy makes me wonder. This was published while aluminum was still very difficult to find and not like super, I use aluminum foil, that's an assumption I'm making right now. If they're like, oh, it's with aluminum and steel, it's like, ooh, aluminum spacey. And the specific call out of radium makes me go, oh, those bullets are gonna kill you, and then they're gonna kill you. Which also kind of probably accidentally calls forward with they're radium bullets. It's like, depleted uranium shells to go faster is what immediately comes to mind to me as a modern reader. Anyway, this is quite far enough to imbue me with great respect for the Martian firearm. Some telepathic force must have warned me against an attempt to escape in broad daylight from under the muzzles of 20 of these death-dealing machines. The Martians, after conversing for a short time, turned and rode away in the direction from which they'd come, leaving one of their number alone by the enclosure. When they had covered perhaps 200 yards, they halted, and turning their mounts toward us, sat watching the warrior by the enclosure. He was the one whose spear had so nearly transfixed me, and was evidently the leader of the band. As I had noted, they seemed to have moved to their present position at his direction. When his force had come to a halt, he dismounted, threw down his spear and his small arms, and came around the end of the incubator toward me, entirely unarmed and naked as I, except for the ornaments strapped upon his head, limbs, and chest. When he was within about 50 feet of me, he unclasped an enormous metal armlet, and holding it toward me in the open palm of his hand, addressed me in a clear, resonant voice, but in a language that it's needless to say I could not understand. He then stopped, as though waiting for my reply, pricking up his antennae-like ears, and cocking his strange-looking eyes still further toward me. As the silence became painful, I concluded to hazard a little conversation on my own part, as I guessed that he was making his overtures of peace. The throwing down of his weapons, the withdrawing of his troops before his advance, would have signified a peaceful mission anywhere on Earth, so why not then here on Mars as well? Placing my hand over my heart, I bowed low to the Martian, and explained to him that while I did not understand his language, his actions spoke for the peace and friendship that at the present moment were most dear to my heart. Of course, I might have been a babbling brook for all the intelligence my speech carried to him, but he understood the action with which I immediately followed my words. Stretching my hand toward him, I advanced and took the armlet from his open palm, clasping it about my arm above the elbow. Armlet above the elbow, then. Here. Smiled at him and stood waiting. His wide mouth spread into an answering smile, and locking one of his intermediary arms in mine, we turned and walked back toward his mount. At the same time, he motioned his followers to advance. They started toward us on a wild run, but were checked by a signal from him. Evidently, he feared that were I to be really frightened again, I might jump entirely out of the landscape. He exchanged a few words with his men, motioned to me that I would ride behind one of them, then mounted his own animal. The fellow designated reached down 2 or 3 hands and lifted me up behind him on the glossy back of his mount, where I hung on as best I could by the belts and straps which held the Martian's weapons and ornaments. The entire cavalcade then turned and galloped away toward the range of hills in the distance. I would sit, but the library's a little busy. For listeners of the podcast, he's cleaning right now. So I'll keep standing for another chapter. Chapter 4, A Prisoner. We'd gone perhaps 10 miles when the ground began to rise very rapidly. We were, as I was later to learn, nearing the edge of one of Mars's long-dead seas, in the bottom of which my encounter with the Martians had taken place. In a short time we gained the foot of the mountains, and after traversing a narrow gorge came to an open valley, at the far extremity of which was a low tableland, upon which I beheld an enormous city. Toward this we galloped, entering it by what appeared to be a ruined roadway leading out from the city, but only to the edge of the tableland, where it ended abruptly in a flight of broad steps. Upon closer observation, I saw as we passed them that the buildings were deserted, and while not greatly decayed, had the appearance of not having been tenanted for years, possibly for ages. Toward the center of the city was a large plaza, and upon this and in the buildings that immediately surrounded it were camped some 900 or 1,000 creatures of the same breed as my captors, for such I now considered them, despite the suave manner in which I had been trapped. With the exception of their ornaments, all were naked. The women varied in appearance but little from the men, except that their tusks were much larger in proportion to their height, in some instances curving nearly to their high-set ears. Their bodies were smaller and lighter in color. Their fingers and toes bore the rudiments of nails which were entirely lacking among the males. The adult females ranged in height from 10 to 12 feet. The children, too, were light in color, even lighter than the women, and all looked precisely alike to me, except that some were taller than others. Older, I presume. I saw no signs of extreme age among them, nor is there any appreciable difference in their appearance from the age of maturity, about 40, until about the age of 1,000 years, where they go voluntarily upon their last strange pilgrimage down the river Is, which leads no living Martian knows whither, and from whose bosom no Martian has ever returned, or would be allowed to live did he return, after once embarking upon its dark, cold waters. Only about 1 Martian in 1,000 dies of sickness or disease. Probably about 20 take the voluntary pilgrimage. The other 979 die violent deaths in duels, in hunting, in aviation, and in war, but perhaps by far the greatest death loss comes during the age of childhood, when vast numbers of the little Martians fall victims to the great white apes of Mars. The average life expectancy of a Martian after the age of maturity is about 300 years, but would be nearer the 1,000 mark were it not for the various means leading to violent death. Owing to the waning resources of the planet, it evidently became necessary to counteract the increasing longevity which their remarkable skill in therapeutics and surgery produced, and so human life has come to be considered but lightly on Mars, as evidenced by their dangerous sports and the almost continual warfare between the various communities. There are other natural causes leading toward a diminution of let's try that again. There are other natural causes tending toward a diminution. Diminution. They're diminishing, you know. Uh, there are other natural causes tending toward a diminution of population, but nothing contributes so greatly to this end as the fact that no male or female Martian is ever voluntarily without a weapon of destruction. As we neared the plaza and my presence was discovered, we were immediately surrounded by hundreds of the creatures who seemed anxious to pluck me from my seat behind the guard. A word from the leader of their party stilled the clamor, and we proceeded at a trot across the plaza to the entrance of as magnificent as an edifice that mortal eyes ever rested upon. The building was low, but it covered an enormous area. It was constructed of gleaming white marble, inlaid with gold and brilliant stones which sparkled and scintillated in the sunlight. The main entrance was some 100 feet in width, and projected from the building proper to form a huge canopy above the entrance hall. There was no stairway, but a gentle incline to the first floor of the building opened into an enormous chamber encircled by galleries. On the floor of this chamber, which was dotted with highly carved wooden desks and chairs, were assembled about 40 or 50 male Martians around the steps of a rostrum. On the platform proper squatted an enormous warrior, heavily loaded with metal ornaments, gay-colored feathers. Let's try that again. On the platform proper squatted an enormous warrior, heavily loaded with metal ornaments, gay-colored feathers, and beautifully wrought leather trappings ingeniously set with precious stones. From his shoulders depended a short cape of white fur lined with brilliant scarlet silk. What struck me as the most remarkable about this assemblage and the hall in which they were congregated was the fact that the creatures were entirely out of proportion to the desks, chairs, and other furnishings, these being of a size adapted to human beings such as I, where the great bulk of Martians could scarcely have squeezed into the chairs, nor was there room beneath the desks for their long legs. Evidently, then, there were other denizens on Mars than the wild and grotesque creatures into whose hands I'd fallen, but the evidences of extreme antiquity which showed all around me indicated these buildings might have belonged to some long extinct or forgotten race in the dim antiquity of Mars. Our party had halted at the entrance of the building, and at a sign from the leader I had again been lowered to the ground. He locked his arm in mine, and we proceeded into the audience chamber. There were few formalities observed in approaching the Martian chieftain. My captor merely strode up to the rostrum, the others making way for him as he advanced. The chieftain rose to his feet and uttered the name of my escort, who, in turn, halted and repeated the name of the ruler, followed by his title. At this time, the ceremony and the words they uttered meant nothing to me, but later I came to know that this was the customary greeting between green Martians. Had the men been strangers, and therefore unable to exchange names, they would have silently exchanged ornaments, and their missions been peaceful. Otherwise, they would have exchanged shots, or have fought out their introduction with some other of their various weapons. My captor, whose name was Tarkus, was virtually the vice-chieftain of the community, and a man of great ability as both a statesman and a warrior. He evidently explained briefly the incidents that had connected with his expedition, including my capture, and when he had concluded, the chieftain addressed me at some length. I replied in our good old English tongue, merely to convince him that neither of us could understand the other, but I noticed that when I smiled slightly on concluding, he did likewise. This fact, and the similar occurrence during my first talk with Tarkas, I'm going to fumble over that name a bunch. This fact, and the similar occurrence during my first talk with Tarkas, convinced me that we had at least something in common, the ability to smile, therefore to laugh, denoting a sense of humor. But I was to learn that the Martian smile is merely perfunctory, the Martian laugh is a thing to cause strong men to blanch in horror. The ideas of humor among the green men of Mars are widely at variance with our conceptions of incitants to merriment. The death agonies of a fellow being are, to these strange creatures, provocative of the wildest hilarity, while their chief form of commonest amusement is to inflict death on their prisoners of war in various ingenious and horrible ways. The assembled warriors and chieftains examined me closely, feeling my muscles and the texture of my skin. The principal chieftain then evidently signified a desire to see me perform, and motioning me to follow, he started with Tarkas for the open plaza. Now I had made no attempt to walk since my first signal failure, except while tightly grasping Tarkas's arm, and so now I went skipping and flitting about among the desks and chairs like a monstrous grasshopper. After bruising myself severely, much to the amusement of the Martians, I again had recourse to creeping, but this did not suit them, so I was roughly jerked to my feet by a towering fellow who had laughed most heartily at my misfortunes. As he banged me down upon my feet, his face was bent close to mine, and I did the only thing a gentleman might do under the circumstances of brutality, boorishness, and lack of consideration for a stranger's rights. I swung my fist squarely to his jaw, and he went down like a felled ox. As he sunk to the floor, I wheeled around with my back toward the nearest desk, expecting to be overwhelmed by the vengeance of his fellows, but determined to give them as good a battle as the unequal odds would permit before I gave up my life. My fears were groundless, however, as the other Martians, at first struck dumb with wonderment, finally broke into wild peals of laughter and applause. I didn't recognize the applause as such, but later, when I had become acquainted with their customs, I learned that I had won what they seldom accord, a manifestation of approbation. The fellow whom I had struck lay where he had fallen, nor did any of his mates approach him. Tarkas advanced toward me, holding out one of his arms, and we thus proceeded to the plaza without further mishap. I did not, of course, know the reason for which we had come to the open, but I was not long in being enlightened. They repeated the word "sock" a number of times, then Tarkas made several jumps, repeating the same word before each leap, and then turning to me, he said, "Sock." I saw what they were after, and gathering myself, I socked with such marvelous success I cleared a good 150 feet, nor did I this time lose my equilibrium, but landed squarely upon my feet without falling. 150 feet in the air, that's wild. I then returned, by easy jumps of 25 or 30 feet, to the little group of warriors. My exhibition had been witnessed by several hundred lesser Martians. They immediately broke into demands for a repetition, which the chieftain then ordered me to make, but I was both hungry and thirsty, and determined on the spot that my only method of salvation was to demand the consideration from these creatures which they evidently would not voluntarily accord. I therefore ignored the repeated commands to sock, and each time they were made I motioned to my mouth and rubbed my stomach. Tarkas and the chief exchanged a few words, and the former, calling to a young female among the throng, gave her some instructions and motioned me to accompany her. I grasped her proffered arm, and together we crossed the plaza toward a large building on the far side. My fair companion was about 8 feet tall, having just arrived at maturity, but was not yet to her full height. She was of light olive-green color, with a smooth, glossy hide. Her name, as I afterward learned, was Sola, and she belonged to the retinue of Tarkas. She conducted me to a spacious chamber in one of the buildings fronting on the plaza, and which, from the litter of silks and furs upon the floor, I took to be the sleeping quarters of several of the natives. The room was well lit by a number of large windows, was beautifully decorated with mural paintings and mosaics, but upon all there seemed to rest that indefinable touch of the finger of antiquity, which convinced me that the architects and builders of these wondrous creations had nothing in common with the crude half-brutes which now occupied them. Sola motioned me to be seated upon a pile of silks near the center of the room, and, turning, made a peculiar hissing sound, as though signaling to someone in an adjoining room. In response to her call, I obtained my first sight of a new Martian wonder. It waddled in on its 10 short legs, and squatted down before the girl like an obedient puppy. The thing was about the size of a Shetland pony, but its head bore a slight resemblance to that of a frog, except the jaws were equipped with 3 rows of long, sharp tusks. Okay. Unfortunately, we are going to have to disturb the cat. Hi, kitty. This is my bird. He's very comfy. Hi. You can sit with Dad. There we go. Okay. Chapter 5. I elude my watchdog. Sola stared into the brute's wicked-looking eyes, muttered a word or two of command, pointed to me, and left the chamber. I could not but wonder what this ferocious-looking monstrosity might do when left alone in such close proximity to such a relatively tender morsel of meat, but my fears were groundless, as the beast, after surveying me intently for a moment, crossed the room to the only exit which led to the street, and lay down full length across the threshold. This was my first experience with a Martian watchdog, but it was destined to not be my last, for this fellow guarded me carefully during the time I remained a captive among these green men, twice saving my life, and never voluntarily being away from me a moment. While Solo was away, I took occasion to examine more minutely the room in which I found myself captive. The mural painting depicted scenes of rare and wonderful beauty. Mountains, rivers, lakes, oceans, meadows, trees and flowers, winding roadways, sun-kissed gardens, scenes which might have portrayed earthly views but for the different colorings of the vegetation. The work had evidently been wrought by a master hand, so subtle the atmosphere, so perfect the technique, yet nowhere was there a representation of a living animal, neither human nor brute, by which I could guess at the likeness of these other and perhaps extinct denizens of Mars. While I was allowing my fancy to run riot in wild conjecture on the possible explanation of the strange anomalies with which I had so far met on Mars, Solo returned, bearing both food and drink. These she placed on the floor beside me, and, seating herself a short ways off, regarded me intently. The food consisted of about a pound of some solid substance, consistency of cheese, and almost tasteless, while the liquid was apparently milk from some animal. It was not unpleasant to the taste, although slightly acid, and I learned in a short time to prize it very highly. It came, as I later discovered, not from an animal, as there's only one mammal on Mars, and that one very rare indeed, rather from a large plant which grows practically without water. It seems to distill its plentiful supply of milk from the products of the soil, the moisture of the air, and the rays of the sun. A single plant of this species would give 8 or 10 quarts of milk per day. After I'd eaten, I was greatly invigorated, but feeling the need of rest, I stretched out upon the silks and was soon asleep. I must have slept several hours, as it was dark when I awoke, and I was very cold. I noticed that someone had thrown a fur over me, but it had become partially dislodged in the darkness. I could not see to replace it. Suddenly, a hand reached out and pulled the fur over me, shortly afterwards adding another to my covering. I presumed that my watchful guardian was Sola, and nor was I wrong. This girl alone, among all the green Martians with whom I came in contact, disclosed characteristics of sympathy, kindliness, and affection. Her ministrations to my bodily wants were unfailing, and her solicitous care saved me from much suffering and many hardships. As I was to learn, the Martian nights are extremely cold, and as there's practically no twilight or dawn, the changes in temperature are sudden and most uncomfortable, as are the transitions from brilliant daylight to darkness. The nights are either brilliantly illumined or very dark, for if neither of the two moons of Mars happen to be in the sky, almost total darkness results, since the lack of atmosphere, or rather the very thin atmosphere, fails to diffuse the starlight to any great extent. On the other hand, if both the moons are in the heavens, the surface of the ground is brightly illuminated. Both of Mars's moons are vastly nearer to her than our moon is to Earth, the nearer moon being but about 5,000 miles distant, while the further is little more than 14,000 miles away, against the nearly 1/4 million miles which separates us from our moon. The nearer moon of Mars makes a complete revolution around the planet in a little over 7.5 hours, so that she may be seen hurtling through the sky like a huge meteor 2 or 3 times each night, revealing all her phases during each transit of the heavens. The further moon revolves about Mars in something over 30.25 hours, where their sister satellite makes a nocturnal Martian scene one of a splendid and weird grandeur. And it is well that nature has so graciously and abundantly lighted the Martian night, for the green men of Mars, being a nomadic race without high intellectual development, have but crude means for artificial light, depending principally upon torches, a kind of candle, and a peculiar oil lamp which generates a gas and burns without a wick. Not wells yet on this particular tale of Mars. We will get to Wells's take on Mars. This is Burroughs' Princess of Mars. This last device produces an intensely brilliant, far-reaching white light, but as the natural oil which it requires can only be obtained by mining in one of several widely separated and remote localities, it is seldom used by these creatures whose only thought is for today, and whose hatred for manual labor is kept in a semi-barbaric state for countless ages. After Sola had replenished my coverings, I again slept, nor did I awaken until daylight. The other occupants of the room, 5 in number, were all female, and they still were sleeping, piled high with a motley array of silks and furs. Across the threshold lay stretched the sleepless guardian brute, just as I had last seen him on the preceding day. Evidently he had not moved a muscle. His eyes were fairly glued upon me, and I fell wondering just what might befall me should I endeavor to escape. Old school with Mars, safe bets, Wells, Burroughs, and Verne. Very fair. I think I've read Verne's take on Mars once or twice. Have I read Vance's take on Mars? I can't recall. I know I've read some off camera. I've read some of Wells' spacefaring stuff. Not a ton of it. But this is my first experience with Burroughs' take on Mars. Very, very Sword of the Planet so far. And I'm very here for it. I've been ever prone to seek adventure and to investigate an experiment where wiser men would have left well enough alone. It therefore now occurred to me the surest way of learning the exact attitude of the beast toward me was to attempt to leave the room. I felt fairly secure in my belief that I could escape him should he pursue me once I was outside the building, for I'd begun to take great pride in my ability as a jumper. Furthermore, I could see from the shortness of his legs that the brute himself was no jumper, probably no runner beside. Slowly and carefully, therefore, I gained my feet, only to see that my watcher did the same. Cautiously I advanced toward him, finding that by moving with a shuffling gait I could retain my balance, as well as make reasonably rapid progress. As I neared the brute, he backed cautiously away from me, and when I had reached the open, he moved to one side to let me pass. He then fell in behind me and followed about 10 paces in my rear as I made my way along the deserted street. Evidently, his mission was to protect me only, I thought, but when we reached the edge of the city, he suddenly sprang before me, uttering strange sounds and baring his ugly and ferocious tusks. Thinking to have some amusement at his expense, I rushed toward him, and when almost on him, sprang into the air, alighting far beyond him and away from the city. He wheeled instantly and charged with the most appalling speed I'd ever beheld. I had thought that his short legs were a bar to his swiftness, but he had been coursing with greyhounds. Had he been coursing with greyhounds, the latter would have appeared as though asleep on a doormat. As I was to learn, this is the fleetest animal on Mars, owing to its intelligence, loyalty, and ferocity. It's used in hunting, in war and as the protector of the Martian man. I quickly saw that I would have difficulty in escaping the fangs of beast on a straightaway course, so I met his charge by doubling in my tracks and leaping over him as he was almost upon me. This maneuver gave me a considerable advantage. I was able to reach the city quite a bit ahead of him. When he came tearing after me, I jumped for a window about 30 feet from the ground in the face of one of the buildings overlooking the valley. Grasping the sill, I pulled myself up to a sitting posture without looking into the building and gazed down at the baffled animal beneath me. My exultation was short-lived, however, for scarcely had I gained a secure seat upon the sill when a huge hand grasped me by the neck from behind and dragged me violently into the room. Here I was thrown upon my back and beheld standing over me a colossal ape-like creature, white and hairless except for an enormous shock of bristly hair upon its head. Chapter 6. The Fight of One Friends. The thing which more nearly resembled our earthly men than it did the Martians I'd seen held me pinioned to the ground with one huge foot, and it jabbered and gesticulated wildly at some answering creature behind me. This other, which was evidently its mate, soon came toward us bearing a mighty stone cudgel, which it evidently intended to brain me. The creatures were about 10 or 15 feet tall, standing erect, and had, like the green Martians, an intermediary set of arms or legs, midway between their upper and lower limbs. Their eyes were close together and non-protruding. Their ears were high-set, but more laterally located than those of the Martians, while their snouts and teeth were strikingly like those of our African gorilla. Altogether, they were not unlovely when viewed in comparison with the green Martians. The cudgel was swinging in the arc which ended upon my upturned face, when a bolt of myriad-legged horror hurled itself through the doorway, full upon the chest of my executioner. With a shriek of fear, the ape which held me leapt through the open window, but its mate closed in with a terrific death struggle. And my preserver, which was nothing less than the faithful, watched them. I cannot bring myself to call so hideous creature a dog. As quickly as possible, I gained my feet, and backing against the wall, I witnessed such a battle as is to be vouchsafed few beings to see. The strength, agility, and blind ferocity of these two creatures is approached by nothing known to earthly man. My beast had an advantage in his first hold, having sunk his mighty fangs far into the chest of his adversary, but the great arms and paws of the ape, backed by muscles far transcending those of the Martian men I'd seen, had locked the throat of my guardian and slowly was choking out his life, and bending back his head and neck upon his body, where I momentarily expected the former to fall limp at the end of a broken neck. In accomplishing this, the ape was tearing away the entire front of its chest, which was held in the vice-like grip of the powerful jaws. Back and forth upon the floor they rolled, neither one emitting a sound of fear or pain. Presently I saw the great eyes of my beast bulging completely from their sockets, and blood flowing from its nostrils. That he was weakening perceptibly was evident, but so also was the ape, whose struggles were growing momentarily less. Suddenly I came to myself, and with that strange instinct which seems ever to prompt me in my duty, I seized the puzzle. Try that again. Suddenly I came to myself, and with that strange instinct which seems ever to prompt me in my duty, I seized the cudgel which had fallen to the floor at the commencement of the battle, and swinging it with all the power of my earthly arms, crashed it full upon the head of the ape, crushing his skull as though it had been an eggshell. Scarcely had the blow descended when I was confronted with a new danger. The ape's mate, recovered from its first shock of terror, had returned to the scene of encounter by the way of the interior of the building. I glimpsed him just before he reached the doorway, and the sight of him, now roaring as he perceived his lifeless fellow stretched upon the floor, and frothing at the mouth in the extremity of his rage, filled me, I must confess, with a dire foreboding. I'm ever willing to stand and fight when the odds are not too overwhelmingly against me, but in this instance I perceived neither glory nor profit in pitting my relatively puny strength against the iron muscles and brutal ferocity of this enraged denizen of an unknown world. In fact, the only outcome of such an encounter, so far as I might be concerned, seemed sudden death. I was standing near the window, and I knew that once in the street I might gain the plaza in safety before the creature could overtake me. At least there was a chance for safety in flight, against almost certain death should I remain and fight, however desperate. It is true I held the cudgel, but what could I do with it against his 4 great arms? Even if I should break one of them with my first blow, for I figured he would attempt to ward off the cudgel, he could reach out and annihilate me with the others before I could recover for a second attack. In the instant that these thoughts passed through my mind, I had turned to make for the window, but my eyes alighted on the form of my erstwhile guardian, and threw all thoughts of flight to the 4 winds. He lay gasping upon the floor of the chamber, his great eyes fastened upon me in what seemed a pitiful appeal for protection. I could not withstand that look, nor could I, on second thought, have deserted my rescuer without giving as good an account of myself in his behalf as he had in mine. Without more ado, therefore, I turned to meet the charge of the infuriated bully. He was now too close upon me for the cudgel to prove of any effective assistance, so I merely threw it as heavily as I could at his advancing bulk. It struck him just below the knees, eliciting a howl of pain and rage, and so throwing him off his balance that he lunged full upon me, with arms stretched wide to ease his fall. Again, as on the preceding day, I had recourse to earthly tactics, and swinging my right fist full upon the point of his chin, I followed it with a smashing left to the pit of his stomach. The effect was marvelous, for as I lightly sidestepped after delivering the second blow, he reeled and fell upon the floor, doubled up with pain and gasping for wind. Leaping over his prostrate body, I seized the cudgel and finished the monster before he could even regain his feet. As I delivered the blow, a low laugh rang out behind me, and turning, I beheld Tarkus, Sola, and 3 or 4 warriors standing in the doorway of the chamber. As my eyes met theirs, I was, for the second time, the recipient of their zealously guarded applause. My absence had been noted by Sola on her awakening, and she had quickly informed Tarkus, who had set out immediately with a handful of warriors to search for me. As they had approached the limits of the city, they had witnessed the actions of the bull ape as he bolted into the building, frothing with rage. They had followed immediately behind him, thinking it barely possible that his actions might prove a clue to my whereabouts, and witnessed my short but decisive battle with him. This encounter, together with my set-to with the Martian warrior on the previous day, and my feats of jumping, placed me upon a high pinnacle in their regard. Evidently devoid of all the finer sentiments of friendship, love, or affection, these people fairly worship physical prowess and bravery. Nothing's too good for the object of their adoration, as long as he maintains his position by repeated examples of his skill, strength, and courage. Sola, who had accompanied the searching party of her own volition, was the only one of the Martians whose face had not been twisted in laughter as I battled for my life. She, on the contrary, was sober with apparent solicitude, and as soon as I had finished the encounter, rushed to me and carefully examined my body for possible wounds or injuries. Satisfying herself that I had come off unscathed, she smiled quietly, and taking my hand, started toward the door of the chamber. Tarkus and the other warriors had entered, and were standing over the now rapidly reviving brute which had saved my life, and whose life I in turn had rescued. They seemed to be deep in argument, and finally one of them addressed me, but remembering my ignorance of his language, turned back to Tarkus, who, with a word and a gesture, gave some command to the fellow, and turned to follow us from the room. There seemed something menacing in their attitude toward my beast, and I hesitated to leave until I had learned the outcome. It was well that I did so, for the warrior drew up an evil-looking pistol from its holster, and was on the point of putting an end to the creature, when I sprang forward and struck up his arm. The bullet striking the wooden casing of the window exploded, blowing a hole completely through the wood and masonry. I then knelt down beside the fearsome-looking thing, and, raising it to its feet, motioned for it to follow me. Looks of surprise which my actions elicited from the Martians were ludicrous. They couldn't understand, except in a feeble and childish way, such attributes as gratitude and compassion. The warrior whose gun I had struck up looked inquiringly at Tarkus for the latter sign that I be left to my own devices. So we returned to the plaza with my great beast following close at heel, and Solo grasping me tightly by the arm. I had at least two friends on Mars, a young woman who watched over me with motherly solicitude, and a dumb brute which, as I later came to know, held in its poor ugly carcass more love, more loyalty, and more gratitude than could have been found in the entire 5,000,000 green Martians who rove the deserted cities and dead sea bottoms of Mars. Tars Tarkus. Okay, now I know it's John Carter. You're correct. Uh, yeah. Disney took a shot at adapting this. While we're between chapters, I'll talk about it. Disney took a shot at adapting this, very confusingly naming the movie John Carter. The Disney version's okay, especially for Disney, but yeah, massive letdown. I have no idea how they flubbed this. Like, I was already initially, like, I was reading the description of this book. Like, I had found an article that was like, the making of John Carter of Mars, and it was like an oral history. And I was like, huh, I never did watch that. But, yeah, a lot of people really didn't care for it. Initially, like, what confused me is the first book is named A Princess of Mars, and, like, the last book, the 10th book in the series, is called John Carter of Mars. So, like, calling the movie John Carter and just completely ditching the Of Mars subtitle until the last credits, like, felt like a really double punch of, we don't know what we're doing with this. But, like, I remember seeing the trailers for John Carter of Mars and going, yeah, that looks like a fun little, little popcorn movie, nothing too interesting. I had no idea it was even an adaptation until I had dug a little further. Sorry, there's something on my floor that I want to clean up. Okay, I'll do the hard way. There we go. Yeah, a lot of people were really mad that the movie was called John Carter of Mars because that's the name of the last book. And, like, I'm sure Disney was very upset to have flubbed this, because it's like, this is a 10-book series. This could have been the MCU before the MCU. But, like, when I had seen the trailers, I was like, oh yeah, that looks fun. I was relatively young at the time. But I was like, oh, that looks fun. I'll maybe go see it. And then, like, a couple people I knew went and saw it, and they were like, yeah, this was terrible. I'm like, oh. And I was, like, digging around for books, and I was like, wait a minute. Princess of Mars. This sounds familiar. And, one thing led to another. I would love to actually sit down and have a movie night with the movie in Discord after we're done reading this. Which, by the way, I have a Discord. I don't really promote it as much as I should, but I really should do more of that. I have a Discord where I've been trying to do some more Discord exclusive content lately. I've been posting a lot more of my baking, the things I've been doing in my day-to-day life in the Discord. Make it worth showing up for, instead of just, ha ha ha, this is where we talk about the thing. So we might consider a movie night in Discord. Who knows? We'll see. Keep one eye on the Discord for it. I'm not gonna promote it too heavily elsewhere, so I don't get ganked by the mouse. Anyway, let's do one more chapter and then we'll hit up an intermission, shall we? Water. Chapter 7. Child Raising on Mars. After a breakfast, which was an exact replica of the meal of the preceding day, and an index of practically every meal which followed while I was with the Green Men of Mars, Sola escorted me to the plaza, where I found the entire community engaged in watching or helping at the harnessing of huge Macedonian animals to great three-wheeled chariots. There were about 250 of these vehicles, each drawn by a single animal, any one of which, from their appearance, might have easily drawn the entire wagon train when loaded. The chariots themselves were large, commodious, and gorgeously decorated. In each was seated a female Martian loaded with ornaments of metal, jewels and silk and furs. Upon the back of each of the beasts which drew the chariots was perched a young Martian driver. Like the animals upon which the warriors were mounted, the heavier draft animals wore neither bit nor bridle, but were guided entirely by telepathic means. This power is wonderfully developed in all Martians, and accounts largely for the simplicity of their language, the relatively few spoken words exchanged even in large conversations. It's the universal language of Mars, through the medium of which the higher and lower animals of this world of paradoxes are able to communicate to a greater or less extent, depending on the intellectual sphere of the species and the development of the individual in particular. As the cavalcade took up the line of march in single file, Sola dragged me into an empty chariot, and we proceeded with the procession toward the point by which I had entered the city the day before. At the head of the caravan rode some 200 warriors, 5 abreast, and a like number brought up the rear, while 25 or 30 outriders flanked up on either side. Everyone but myself, men, women, and children, were heavily armed. At the tail of each chariot trotted a Martian hound, my own beast following closely behind ours. In fact, the faithful creature never left me voluntarily during the entire 10 years I spent on Mars. Our way was led out across the little valley before the city, through the hills and down into the Dead Sea bottom, which I had traversed on my journey from the incubator to the plaza. The incubator, as it proved, was the terminal point of our journey this day, and the entire cavalcade broke into a mad gallop as soon as the page would turn. As soon as we reached the level expanse of the sea bottom, we were soon within sight of our goal. On reaching it, the chariots were parked with military precision on the 4 sides of the enclosure, and half a score of warriors headed by the enormous chieftain, including Taurus Tarkus, several other lesser chiefs, dismounted and advanced toward it. I could see Taurus Tarkus explaining something to the principal chieftain, whose name, by the way, was, as nearly as I can translate it into English, Lequas Tiomel Yed, Yed being his title. Tomel? Like, is that P silent as in Ptolemy? Tomel. Tomel makes sense. I'll be saying it that way. Yed being his title. Can my pages turn? Very sticky pages on this ebook. Who dumped it in the jam? I was soon appraised of the subject of their conversation, as, calling to Sola, Taurus Tarkus signed for her to send me to him. I had by this time mastered the intricacies of walking under Martian conditions, and quickly responding to his command, I advanced to the side of the incubator where the warriors stood. As I reached their side, a glance showed me that all but a very few eggs had hatched, the incubator being fairly alive with the hideous little devils. They ranged in height from 3 to 4 feet, and were moving restlessly about the enclosure as though searching for food. As I came to a halt before him, Taurus Tarkus pointed over the incubator and said, "Suck." I saw that he wanted me to repeat my performance of yesterday for the edification of Lequas Tomel, and as I must confess that my prowess gave me no little satisfaction, I responded quickly, leaping entirely over the parked chariots on the far side of the incubator. As I returned, Lequas Tomel grunted something at me, and turning to his warriors, gave a few words of command relative to the incubator. They paid no further attention to me, and I was thus permitted to remain close and watch their operations, which consisted in breaking an opening in the wall of the incubator, large enough to permit the exit of the young Martians. On either side of the opening, The women and the younger Martians, both male and female, formed two solid walls leading out through the chariots and quite away into the plain beyond. Between these walls the little Martians scampered, wild as deer, being permitted to run the full length of the aisle, where they were captured one at a time by the women and older children, the last in the line capturing the first little one to reach the end of the gauntlet, or opposite in the line capturing the second, and so on and so forth, until all the little fellows had left the enclosure and had been appropriated by some youth or female. As the women caught the young, they fell out of line and returned to their respective chariots, while those who fell into the hands of the young men were later turned over to some of the women. I saw that the ceremony, if it could be dignified by such a name, was over, and seeking out Sola, I found her in our chariot, with a hideous little creature held tightly in her arms. The work of rearing young green Martians consists solely in teaching them to talk and to use the weapons of warfare with which they are loaded down from the very first year of their lives. Coming from eggs in which they've lain for 5 years, the period of incubation, they step forth into the world perfectly developed except in size. Entirely unknown to their mothers, who in turn would have had difficulty in pointing out the fathers with any degree of accuracy, they're the common children of the community, and their education devolves upon the females who chance to capture them as they leave the incubator. Their foster mothers may not have even had an egg in the incubator, as was the case with Sola, who had not commenced to lay until less than a year before she became the mother of another woman's offspring. But this counts for little among the Green Martians, as parental and filial love is as unknown to them as it is common among us. I believe this horrible system, which is carried on for ages, is the direct cause of the loss of all the finer feelings and higher humanitarian instincts among these poor creatures. From birth they know no father or mother love. They know not the meaning of the word home. They are taught that they are only suffered to live until they can demonstrate by their physique and their ferocity that they are fit to live. Should they prove deformed or defective in any way, they are promptly shot, nor do they see a tear shed for a single one of the many cruel hardships they pass through from the earliest infancy. I do not mean that the adult Martians are unnecessarily or intentionally cruel to their young, but theirs is a hard and pitiless struggle for existence upon a dying planet, the natural resources of which have dwindled to a point where the support of each additional life means an added tax upon the community into which it's thrown. By careful selection, they rear only the hardiest specimens of each species, and with almost supernatural foresight, they regulate the birth rate to merely offset the loss by death. Each adult Martian female brings forth about 13 eggs each year, and those which meet the size, weight, and specific gravity tests are hidden in the recesses of some subterranean vault where the temperature is too low for incubation. Every year these eggs are carefully examined by a council of 20 chieftains, and all but about 100 of the most perfect are destroyed out of each yearly supply. At the end of 5 years, about 500 almost perfect eggs have been chosen from the 1,000 brought forth. These are then placed in an almost airtight incubator to be hatched by the sun's rays after a period of another 5 years. The hatching which we had witnessed today was a kind of fairly representative event, all but about 1% of the eggs hatching in 2 days. If the remaining eggs ever hatched, we knew nothing of the fate of those little Martians. They weren't wanted, because their offspring might inherit and transmit the tendency to prolonged incubation, and thus upset the system which is maintained for ages, and which permits the adult Martians to figure the proper time for return to the incubators, almost to an hour. The incubators are built in remote fastnesses where there's little or no likelihood of their being discovered by other tribes. And the result of such a catastrophe would mean no children in the community for another 5 years. I was later to witness the results of discovery of an alien incubator. The community of which the Green Martians with whom my lot was cast formed a part which composed some 30,000 souls. They roamed on an enormous tract of arid and semi-arid land between 40 and 80 degrees south latitude, and bounded on the east and west by 2 large fertile tracts.
Their headquarters lay in the southwest corner of this district, near the crossing of two of the so-called Martian canals. As the incubator had been placed far north of their own territory, in a supposedly uninhabited and unfrequented area, we had before us a tremendous journey, concerning which I, of course, knew nothing. After our return to the dead city, I had passed several days in comparative idleness. On the day following our return, all the warriors had ridden forth early in the morning, and had not returned until just before darkness fell. As I later learned, they had been to the subterranean vaults in which the eggs were kept, and had transported them to the incubator, which they had then walled up for another 5 years, and which, in all probability, would not be visited again during that period. The vaults which held the eggs until they were ready for the incubator were located many miles south of the incubator, and could be visited yearly by the council of 20 chieftains. When they did not arrange to build their vault, why they did not arrange to build their vaults and incubators nearer to home has always been a mystery to me, and, like many other Martian mysteries, unresolved and unsolvable by earthly reasoning and earthly customs. Sola's duties were now doubled, as she was compelled to care for the young Martian as well as me, but neither one of us required much attention, as we were both about equally advanced in Martian education. Sola took it upon herself to train us together. Her prize consisted in a male about 4 feet tall, very strong, physically perfect. Also, he learned quickly, and we had considerable amusement, at least I did, over the keen rivalry we displayed. The Martian language, as I have said, is extremely simple, and in a week I could make all my wants known and understand nearly everything that was said to me. Likewise, under Sola's tutelage, I developed my own telepathic powers so I could shortly sense practically everything that went on around me. What surprised Sola most in me was that while I could catch telepathic messages easily from others, and often when they were not intended for me, no one could read a jot from my mind under any circumstances. At first this vexed me greatly, but later I was very glad of it, as it gave me an undoubted advantage over the Martians. Alright, folks, I am going to take a little break, grab a little water, pet my pets, take care of some this, some that, and potentially even some other. I will be back in about 15 minutes. Nobody explode while I'm out. The stream will be quiet. We were reading mere moments ago before we decided to be right back. We're reading A Princess of Mars, the first John Carter novel. Oh, do I? Explodes. Capo, that's a big mess. Why are you why are you exploding, making a big mess? At least make funny ragdoll before you explode. Anyway, I will be right back. It will be at the longest 15 minutes. Genuinely, I think I'm just going to run inside and grab some water. Maybe rest my voice a little bit. Maybe do a little Googling as to some facts that I was like, oh, I wonder if this is a thing. It shouldn't be long. Everything's fine. Nothing's on fire. Pet your cats for me, if you have them. Definitely get some water. Stretch if you've been sitting, like I have. Meds, too, if you have those. Uh-huh. Oh, oh, not the hiccups. I just wanted everybody to hear some rain. Oh, horrible time for hiccups. I will sit here and languish with my hiccups as quietly as possible so you all can hear the rain. Oh. These hiccups are very poorly timed. You know, I should really sometime... Oh, good heavens. Okay, let me turn the filter back off because as much as I am enjoying the rain sounds, I don't want them in the background along with like the 4 or 5 other things that creep in that I would also allow the rain sounds in. Really, I wish I could do like a notched filter of like a specific set of frequencies, like ignore this water from the cat fountain frequency and ignore the sound of the space heater making noise. But then that also takes a chunk out of the noises that my mouth makes, which, you know, doesn't sound super good sometimes. Okay. We have a cat, as you can see. I did a little Googling. Just little G Googling as a treat. And the Bayer process for aluminum that made aluminum, you know, prolifically available enough to let us have aluminum foil was invented in 1888. The opening of this book is set in 1886, which is, you know, previous to 1888. And so for sure aluminum was like super, super rare at the time John Carter goes to Mars and finds that these Martian types are using an aluminum steel alloy for their weapons. Uh, you know, to the point that like aluminum was so rare at the time and so sought after that they used aluminum as the capstone for the Washington Monument. And yes, that is the only reason I know that aluminum was very rare prior to a random specific year that now I know. 1888. Kind of a neat little fun fact, honestly. That'd be a good trivia question. Like, you know, I would say a good handful of people know that, like, aluminum used to be super rare. But what year the process that made aluminum less of a luxury being invented is a fantastic trivia question. A lot of times with a lot of times with the recent books we've been doing, there's been a lot of like me going, okay, when is this set? What was available at this time? We have a lot of it with Dracula because, you know, Dracula, Stoker's
Stoker really was trying to write like a tech fic, for lack of a better way to put it, a tech fic. You know, a kind of very cutting edge science fact thing. Oh, I just dropped my mouse. You know, let's see if I can grab that without disturbing the cat. Success! I have successfully not disturbed the cat. I love the just like casual dropping of, oh yeah, my main character John Carter. Yeah, he can jump. He can jump like an absurd. He's extremely strong. He's an absurdly high jumper. Also, he just learns telepathy just from the local people on the planet. What kind of Sword and Planet like manga main character Mary Sue type character development is that? Just, oh yeah, I learned telepathy in like a week. That's just, I love it. I love when like the main character just is wildly overcompetent at things. It's very fun to me. It's such a fun like, maybe it's just because I've grown up with stuff that has it so much, but like people fling around Mary Sue as an insult, and I'm like, no. No, those are fun characters. You just have to design your setting so that they continue to have challenges. It's fun. Like, yeah, you can throw it around as a criticism, but it is not like, it is not the nail in the coffin of a story to me. I think you can write a Mary Sue and have it be very, very fun. Or a Gary Stu, for that matter. Mm, you know, you just have to. You got to do things in a particular way. You got to build the story around the fact that your character can just do things. Anyway, before I dive into the minutiae of what a good fan fiction looks like, because that was genuinely the tangent I was about to go on. Let's read chapter 8 here. We'll be going for about another hour? Question mark. Whatever chapter boundary is closest to an hour. I would love to go for 4 tonight, but I think 3 is what my throat has in me. I took a week off and now my throat's angry with me. Anyway, chapter 8, A Fair Captive from the Sky. The 3rd day after the incubator ceremony, we set forth toward home, but scarcely had the head of the procession debouched into the open ground before the city than orders were given for an immediate and hasty return. As though trained for years in this particular evolution, the green Martians melted like mist into the spacious doorways of the nearby buildings until, in less than 3 minutes, the entire cavalcade of chariots, mastodons, and mounted warriors was nowhere to be seen. Savants come in 2 ways. You're defining the genre and your crap at Deus Ex Machina. Fair. Yeah, they can be very fun in the right context. Sola and I had entered a building upon the front of the city, in fact the same one in which I had had my encounter with the apes, and wishing to see what had caused the sudden retreat, I mounted to an upper floor and peered from out the window over the valley and the hills beyond, and there I saw the cause of their sudden scurrying to cover. A huge craft, long, low, and gray-painted, swung slowly over the crest of the nearest hill. Following it came another, and another, and another, until 20 of them, swinging low above the ground, sailed slowly and majestically toward us. Each carried a strange banner swung from stern to stern above the upper works, and upon the prow of each was painted some odd device that gleamed in the sunlight and showed plainly, even at the distance from which we were from the vessels. I could see figures crowding the forward decks and upper works of the aircraft. Whether they discovered us or were simply looking at the deserted city, I could not say, but in any event they received a rude reception, for suddenly and without warning, the green Martian warriors fired a terrific volley from the windows of the buildings facing the little valley upon which the great ships were so peacefully advancing. Instantly the scene changed as by magic. The foremost vessel swung broadside toward us, and bringing her guns into play, returned our fire at the same time moving parallel to our front for a short distance, then turning back with the evident intention of completing a great circle which would bring her up to position once more opposite our firing line. The other vessels followed in her wake, each one opening upon us as she swung into position. Our own fire never diminished. I doubt if 25% of our shots went wild. It had never been given me to see such deadly accuracy of aim, and it seemed as though a little figure on one of the craft dropped at the explosion of each bullet, while the banners and upper works dissolved in spurts of flame as the irresistible projectiles of our warriors mowed through them. The fire from the vessels was most ineffectual, owing, as I afterward learned, to the unexpected suddenness of the first volley, which caught the ship's crews entirely unprepared, and the sighting apparatus of the guns unprotected from the deadly aim of our warriors. It seems that each green warrior, to certain objective points for his fire, has relatively identical circumstances of warfare. For example, a proportion of them, always the best marksmen, direct their fire entirely upon the wireless finding and sighting apparatus of the big guns of an attacking naval force. Another detail attends to the smaller guns in the same way. Others pick off the gunners, still others the officers, while certain other quotas concentrate their attention upon the other members of the crew, upon the upper works, and upon the steering gear and propellers. That's actually really clever, having like specific target types to give certain regiments of yours. They're always looking for sort of the same thing. I mean, if you can get precise enough, that's really clever. Also, love the notation of these big airships as naval. Very, very telling of the era in which this was written. Anyway, 20 minutes after the first volley, the great fleet swung, trailing off in the direction from which it had first appeared. Several of the craft were limping perceptibly, and seemed but barely under the control of their depleted crews. Their fire had ceased entirely, and all their energies seemed focused upon escape. Our warriors then rushed up to the roofs of the buildings which we occupied, and followed the retreating armada with a continuous fusillade of deadly fire. One by one, however, the ships managed to dip below the crest of the outlying hills, until only one barely moving craft was in sight. This had received the brunt of our fire, and seemed to be entirely unmanned, as not a moving figure was visible upon her decks. Slowly she swung from her course, circling back toward us in an erratic and pitiful manner. Instantly the warriors ceased firing, for it was quite apparent the vessel was completely helpless, and far from being in a position to inflict harm upon us, she could not even control herself efficiently to escape. As she neared the city, the warriors rushed out upon the plain to meet her, but it was evident that she was still too high for them to have hope to reach her decks. From my vantage point in the window, I could see the bodies of her crew strewn about, although I could not make out what manner of creatures they might be. Not a sign of life was manifest upon her. She drifted slowly with a light breeze in the southeasterly direction. She was drifting some 50 feet above the ground, followed by all but some 100 of the warriors, who had been ordered back to the roofs to cover the possibility of a return of the fleet or of reinforcements. It soon became evident that she would strike the face of the buildings about a mile south of our position. As I watched the progress of the chase, I saw a number of warriors gallop ahead, dismount, and enter the building she seemed destined to touch. As the craft neared the building, and just before she struck, the Martian warriors swarmed upon her from the windows, with their great spears eased the shock of the collision, and in a few moments they had thrown out grappling hooks, and the big boat was being hauled to ground by their fellows above, or rather fellows below. After making her fast, they swarmed the sides and searched the vessel from stem to stern. I could see them examining the dead sailors, evidently for signs of life, and presently a party of them appeared from below, dragging a little figure among them. The creature was considerably less than half as tall as the green Martian warriors, and from my balcony I could see that it walked erect upon two legs, and surmised that it was some new and strange Martian monstrosity with which I had not yet become acquainted. They removed their prisoner to the ground, and then commenced a systematic rifling of the vessel. This operation required several hours, during which time a number of the chariots were requisitioned to transport the loot,
which consisted in arms, ammunition, silks, furs, jewels, strangely carved stone vessels, and a quantity of solid foods and liquids, including many casks of water, the first of which I had seen since my advent upon Mars. After the last load had been removed by the warriors, they made lines fast to the craft and towed her out into the valley in a southwesterly direction. A few of them then boarded her and were busily engaged in what appeared, from my distant position, the emptying of the contents of various carboys upon the dead bodies of the sailors and over the decks and works of the vessel. This operation concluded, they hastily clambered over her sides, sliding down the guy ropes to the ground. The last warrior to leave the deck turned and threw something back upon the vessel, waiting an instant to note the outcome of his act. As a faint spurt of flame rose from the point where the missile struck, he swung over the side and was quickly upon the ground. Scarcely had he alighted than the guy ropes were simultaneously released, and the great warship, lightened by the removal of the loot, soared majestically into the air, her decks and upper works a mass of roaring flame. Slowly she drifted to the southeast, rising higher and higher as the flames ate away her wooden parts and diminished the weight upon her. Ascending to the roof of the building, I watched her for hours, and finally she was lost in the dim vistas of the distance. The sight was awe-inspiring in the extreme, as one contemplated this mighty floating funeral pyre, drifting unguided and unmanned through the lonely wastes of the Martian heavens, a derelict of death and destruction, typifying this life story of those strange and ferocious creatures into whose unfriendly hands fate had carried it. Much depressed, and to me unaccountably so, I had slowly descended to the street. The scene I had witnessed seemed to mark the defeat and annihilation of the forces of a kindred people, rather than the routing by our green warriors of a horde of similar though unfriendly creatures. I could not fathom the seeming hallucination, nor could I free myself from it, but somewhere in the innermost recesses of my soul I felt a strange yearning toward those unknown foemen, and a mighty hope surged through me that the fleet could return and demand a reckoning from the green warriors who had so ruthlessly and wantonly attacked it. Close at my heel, in his now accustomed place, followed Woola, the hound, and as I emerged upon the street, Sola rushed up to me as though I had been the subject of some search on her part. The cavalcade was returning to the plaza, the homeward march having been given up for that day, nor, in fact, was it recommended for more than a week, owing to the fear of a return attack by the aircraft. Loquas Tomel was too astute an old warrior to be caught upon the open plains with a caravan of chariots and children, and so we remained at the deserted city until the danger seemed past. As Sola and I entered the plaza, a sight met my eyes which filled my whole being with a great surge of mingled hope, fear, exultation, and depression, and yet most dominant was a subtle sense of relief and happiness, for just as we neared the throng of Martians, I caught a glimpse of the prisoner from the battlecraft who was being roughly dragged into a nearby building by a couple of green Martian females. And the sight which met my eyes was that of a slender, girlish figure, similar in every detail to the earthly women of my past life. She did not see me at first, but just as she was disappearing through the portal of the building, which was to be her prison, she turned, and her eyes met mine. Her face was oval and beautiful in the extreme, where every feature was finely chiseled and exquisite, her eyes large and lustrous, and her head surmounted by a mass of coal-black waving hair, caught loosely into a strange yet becoming coiffure. Coiffature? Coiffature, probably. Her skin was of a light reddish copper, against which the crimson glow of her cheeks and the ruby of her beautifully molded lips shone with a strangely enhancing effect. She was as destitute of clothes as the green Martians who accompanied her. Indeed, save for her highly wrought ornaments, she was entirely naked, nor could any apparel have enhanced the beauty of her perfect and symmetrical figure. As her gaze rested on me, her eyes opened wide in astonishment. She made a little sign with a free hand, a sign which I did not, of course, understand. Just a moment we gazed upon each other. Then the look of hope and renewed courage which had glorified her face as she discovered me faded into one of utter dejection, mingled with loathing and contempt. I realized I had not answered her signal, and, ignorant as I was of Martian customs, intuitively felt that she'd made an appeal for my succor and protection, which my unfortunate ignorance had prevented me from answering. Then she was dragged out of my sight to the depths of the deserted edifice. Chapter 9. I Learn the Language. As I came back to myself, I glanced at Sola, who had witnessed this encounter, and I was surprised to note a strange expression upon her usually expressionless countenance. What her thoughts were, I did not know, for as yet I had learned but little of the Martian tongue, enough only to suffice for my daily needs. As I reached the doorway of our building, a strange surprise awaited me. A warrior approached bearing the arms, ornaments, and full accoutrement of his kind. These he presented to me with a few unintelligible words, and a bearing at once respectful and menacing. Later, Sola, with the aid of several of the other women, remodeled the trappings to fit my lesser proportions, and after they completed the work, I went about garbed in all the panoply of war. From then on, Sola instructed me in the mysteries of the various weapons, and with the Martian young, I spent several hours each day practicing upon the plaza. I was not yet proficient with all the weapons, but my great familiarity with similar earthly weapons made me an unusually apt pupil, and I progressed in a very satisfactory manner. The training of myself and the young Martians was conducted solely by the women, who not only attend to the education of the young in arts of individual defense and offense, but are also the artisans who produce every manufactured article wrought by the Green Martians. They make the powder, the cartridges, the firearms. In fact, everything of value is produced by the females. In time of actual warfare, they form a part of the reserves, and when the necessity arises, fight with even greater intelligence and ferocity than the men. The men are trained in the higher branches of the art of war, in strategy and maneuvering of large bodies of troops. They make the laws as they're needed, a new law for each emergency. They are unfettered by precedent in the administration of justice. Customs have been handed down by ages of repetition, but the punishment for ignoring a custom is a matter for the individual treatment by a jury of the culprit's peers. And I may say that justice seldom misses fire, but rather seems to rule in an inverse ratio to the ascendancy of law. In one respect at least, the Martians are a happy people, for they have no lawyers. I did not see the prisoner again for several days subsequent to our first encounter, and then only to catch a fleeting glimpse of her as she was being conducted to the great audience chamber, where I had my first meeting with Lorquas Tomel. I could not but note the unnecessary harshness and brutality with which her guards treated her, so different from the almost maternal kindliness which Sola manifested toward me, and the respectful attitude of the few green Martians who took the trouble to notice me at all. I had observed on the 2 occasions when I had seen her that the prisoner exchanged words with her guards, and this convinced me that they spoke, or at least could make themselves understood, by a common language. With this added incentive, I nearly drove Sola distracted by my importunities to hasten on in my education, and within a few more days I had mastered the Martian tongue sufficiently well to enable me to carry on a passable conversation and to understand practically all that I heard. At this time our sleeping quarters were occupied by 3 or 4 females and a couple of the recently hatched young besides. Sola and her wonderful ward, myself, and Mula the hound. After they had retired for the night, it was customary for the adults to carry on a desultory conversation for a short time before lapsing into sleep. Now that I could understand their language, I was always a keen listener, although I never proffered any remarks myself. On the night following the prisoner's visit to the audience chamber, the conversation finally fell upon the subject, and I was all ears on the instant. I had feared to question Sola relative to the beautiful captive, as I could not but recall the strange expression I had noted upon her face after my first encounter with that prisoner. That it denoted jealousy I couldn't say, and yet, judging by all things from a mundane standard as I still did, I felt it safer to affect indifference in the matter until I learned more. Surely Sola's attitude, or until I learned more surely Sola's attitude toward the object of my solicitude. Sarkoja, one of the older women who shared our domicile, had been present at the audience as one of the captive guards, and it was toward her the question turned. "When," asked one of the women, "will we enjoy the death throes of the Red One? Or does Lorquas Tomel, Yed, intend holding her for ransom? They've decided to carry her with us back to Tharp, and may exhibit her last agonies at the great games before Thal Hajus. But what will be the manner of her going out? She's very small and very beautiful. I'd hoped they'd hold her for ransom." Sarkoja and the other woman grunted angrily at this evidence of weakness on the part of Sola. "It is said, Sola, you were not born 1,000,000 years ago," snapped Sarkoja, "when all the hollows of the land were filled with water, and the people were as soft as the stuff they sailed upon. In our day, they've progressed to a point where with such sentiments mark weakness and atavism. It will not be well for you to permit Tartarchus to hear and to learn that you hold such degenerate sentiments, as I doubt that he'd care to entrust such as you with the grave responsibilities of maternity." "I see nothing wrong with my expression of interest in this Red Woman," retorted Sola. "She's never harmed us, nor would she, nor would she should we fallen into her hands. It's only the men of her kind who wage war upon us. I've ever thought that their attitude toward us is but the reflection of ours toward them. They live at peace with all their fellows, except when duty calls upon them to make war, while we're at peace with none, forever warring among our own kind, as well as among the red men, and even in our own communities the individuals fight amongst themselves. Oh, it's one continual awful period of bloodshed from the time we break the shell until we gladly embrace the bosom of the river of mystery, the dark and ancient Is which carries us to an unknown, but at least no more frightful and terrible existence. Fortunate indeed is he who meets his end in an early death. Say what you please to Tartarchus, he can mete out no worse fate to me than a continuation of the horrible existence we're forced to lead in this life." This wild outbreak on the part of Sola so greatly surprised and shocked the other women that, after a few words of general reprimand, they were all lapsed into silence and were soon asleep. One thing the episode had accomplished was to assure me of Sola's friendliness toward the poor girl, and also to convince me that I had been extremely fortunate into falling into her hands rather than some of the other females. I knew that she was fond of me, and now that I had discovered that she hated cruelty and barbarity, I was confident that I could depend upon her to aid me and the girl captive to escape, provided, of course, that such a thing was within the range of possibilities. I did not even know that there were any better conditions to escape to, but I was more than willing to make my chances after people fashioned on my own mold, rather than to remain longer among the hideous and bloodthirsty green men of Mars. But where to go and how was as much of a puzzle to me as the age-old search for the spring of eternal life has been to earthly men since the beginning of time. I decided that at the first opportunity I would take Sola into my confidence, and thus openly ask her to aid me. And with this resolution strong upon me, I turned among my silks and furs, and slept the dreamless and refreshing sleep of Mars. Chapter 10. Champion in Chief. Early the next morning I was astir. Considerable freedom was allowed me, as Sola had informed me, that so long as I did not attempt to leave the city, I was free to go and come as I pleased. She had warned me, however, against venturing forth unarmed, as this city, like all other deserted metropolises of an ancient Martian civilization, was peopled by the great white apes of my second day's adventure. In advising me that I must not leave the boundaries of the city,
Sola had explained that Woola would prevent this anyway should I attempt to it, and she warned me most urgently not to arouse his fierce nature by ignoring his warnings should I venture too close to a forbidden territory. His nature was such that, she said, that he would bring me back into the city dead or alive should I persist in opposing him, and preferably dead, she had added. On this morning I had chosen a new street to explore when suddenly I found myself at the limits of the city. Before me were low hills pierced by narrow and weaving ravines. I longed to explore the country before me, and, like the pioneer stock from which I sprang, to view what the landscape beyond the encircling hills might disclose from the summits which shut out my view. It also occurred to me that this would prove an excellent opportunity to test the qualities of Woola. I was convinced that the brute loved me. I'd seen more evidences of affection in him than any other Martian animal, man or beast, and I was sure that the gratitude for the acts that had twice saved his life would more than outweigh his loyalty to the duty imposed upon him by cruel and loveless masters. As I approached the boundary line, Woola ran anxiously before me and thrust his body against my legs. His expression was pleading rather than ferocious, nor did he bare his great tusks or utter his fearful guttural warnings. Denied the friendship and companionship of my kind, I had developed considerable affection for Woola and Sola, for the normal earthly man must have some outlet for his natural affections, so I decided upon an appeal to a like instinct in this great brute, sure that I would not be disappointed. I had never petted nor fondled him, but now I sat upon the ground, and putting my arms around his heavy neck, stroked and coaxed him, talking in my newly acquired Martian tongue, as I would have to my hound at home, as I would have talked to any other friend among the lower animals. His response to my manifestation of affection was remarkable to a degree. He stretched his great mouth to its full width, baring the entire expanse of his upper rows of tusks, and wrinkling his snout until his great eyes were almost hidden by the folds of flesh. If you've ever seen a collie smile, you may have some idea of Woola's facial distortion. He threw himself upon his back and fairly wallowed at my feet, jumped up and sprang round me, rolling me upon the ground by his great weight, then wriggling and squirming around me like a playful puppy, presenting its back for the petting that it's craving. I could not resist the ludicrousness of the spectacle, and holding my sides I rocked back and forth in the first laughter which had passed my lips in many days, the first, in fact, since the morning Powell had left camp when his horse, long unused, had precipitately and unexpectedly bucked him off head foremost into a pot of frijoles. My laughter frightened Woola. His antics ceased, and he crawled pitifully toward me, poking his ugly head far into my lap. Then I remembered what laughter signified on Mars: torture, suffering, and death. Quieting myself, I rubbed the poor old fellow's head and back, talked to him for a few more minutes, then in an authoritative tone commanded him to follow me, and arising, started for the hills. There was no further question of authority between us. Woola was my devoted slave from that moment hence, and I his only undisputed master. My walk to the hills occupied but a few minutes, and I found nothing of particular interest to reward me. Numerous brilliantly colored and strangely formed wildflowers dotted the ravines, and from the summit of the first hill I saw still other hills stretching off toward the north, and rising one range above another, until lost in mountains of quite respectable dimensions, though I afterward found that only a few peaks on all Mars exceed 4,000 feet in height. The suggestion of magnitude was merely relative. My morning's walk had been large with importance to me, for it had resulted in a perfect understanding with Woola, upon whom Tars Tarkas relied for my safe keeping. I now knew that while I was theoretically a prisoner, I was virtually free, and I hastened to regain the city limits before the defection of Woola could be discovered by his erstwhile masters. The adventure decided me never again to leave the limits of my prescribed stomping grounds till I was ready to venture forth for good and all, as it would certainly result in a curtailment of my liberties, as well as the probable death of Woola were we to be discovered. On regaining the plaza, I had my third glimpse of the captive girl. She was standing with her guards before the entrance to the audience chamber. As I approached, she gave me one haughty glance and turned her back full upon me.
The act was so womanly, so earthly womanly, that though it stung my pride, it also warmed my heart with a feeling of companionship. It was good to know that someone else on Mars besides myself had human instincts of a civilized order, even though the manifestation of them was uh, so painful, mortifying. Had a green Martian woman desired to show dislike or contempt, she would, in all likelihood, have done it with a sword thrust or a movement of her trigger finger, but as their sentiments are mostly atrophied, would have required a serious injury to arouse such passions in them. Sola, let me add, was an exception to this rule. I never saw her perform a cruel or uncouth act, or fail in uniform kindness and good nature. She was, indeed, as her fellow Martian had said of her, an atavism, a dear and precious reversion of the former type of her loved and loving ancestor. Seeing that the prisoner seemed the center of attraction, I halted to view the proceedings. I had not long to wait, for presently Loquas Tomel and his retinue of chieftains approached the building, and, signing the guards to follow with the prisoner, entered the audience chamber. Realizing that I was a somewhat favored character, and also convinced that the warriors did not know of my proficiency in their language, as I had pled with Sola to keep it a secret on the grounds that I didn't wish to be forced to talk with the men until I had perfectly mastered the Martian tongue, I chanced an attempt to enter the audience chamber and listen to the proceedings. The council squatted upon the steps of the rostrum, while below them stood the prisoner and her two guards. I saw that one of the women was Sarkoja, and thus understood how she had been present at the hearing of the preceding day, the results of which she had reported to the occupants of our dormitory last night. Her attitude toward the captive was most harsh and brutal. When she held her, she sunk her rudimentary nails into the poor girl's flesh, or twisted her arm in a most painful manner. When it was necessary to move her from one spot to another, she either jerked her roughly or pushed her headlong before her. She seemed to be venting upon this poor, defenseless creature all the hatred, cruelty, ferocity, and spite of her 900 years, backed by an unguessable age of fierce and brutal ancestors. The other woman was less cruel because she was entirely indifferent. If the prisoner had been left to her alone, and fortunately she was, at night, she would have received no harsh treatment, nor, by the same token, would she have received any attention at all. As Lacroix Tomel raised his eyes to address the prisoner, they fell on me, and he turned to Tars Tarkas with a word and a gesture of impatience. Tars Tarkas made some reply that I didn't catch, but which caused Lacroix Tomel to smile, after which they paid no further attention to me. "What is your name?" asked Lacroix Tomel, addressing the prisoner. "Deja Thoris, daughter of Morse Kajak of Helium." Okay, stop. Deja Thoris is a name that sticks out to me. I know she's an important character because I recognize her name. I don't know what she does in the larger story. I think she obviously John Carter here has eyes for Deja. But like, what is your name? What is your quest? Yes, I did give Lurquas that voice on purpose. He seems like a "what is your name" type guy. Anyway, and the nature of your expedition? It was a purely scientific research party sent out by my father's father, the Jadak of Helium, to rechart the air currents and to take atmosphere density tests, replied the fair prisoner in a low, well-modulated voice. We were unprepared for battle, as we were on a peaceful mission, as our banners and the colors of our craft denoted. The work we were doing was as much in your interest as ours, for you know full well that were it not for our labors and the fruits of our scientific operations, there would not be enough air or water on Mars to support a single human life. For ages we've maintained the air and water supply at practically the same point without an appreciable loss. We've done this in the face of your brutal and ignorant interference, you green men. Why, oh why, will you not learn to live in amity with your fellows? Must you ever go on down the ages to your final extinction, but little above the plane of dumb brutes that serve you? a people without written language, without art, without homes, without love, the victims of eons of the horrible community idea. Owing everything in common, even to your women and children, owning everything in common, rather, even to your women and children, has resulted in your owning nothing in common. You hate each other as you all hate everyone else except yourselves. Come back to the ways of our common ancestors. Come back to the light of kindliness and fellowship. The way is open to you. You'll find the hands, the red men, stretched out to aid you. Together we may still do more to regenerate our dying planet. The granddaughter of the greatest and mightiest of the Red Jadoks has asked you. Will you come? Lorquas Tomel and the warriors sat looking silently and intently at the young woman for several moments after she'd ceased speaking. What was passing in their minds no man may know, but that they were moved I truly believe. And if one man high among them had been strong enough to rise above custom, that moment would have marked a new and mighty era for Mars. I saw Tarkus rise to speak, and on his face was such an expression as I had never seen upon the countenance of a great Martian warrior. It was spoken inward in mighty battle with self, with heredity, with age-old custom, and as he opened his mouth to speak, a look of benignity, kindliness, momentarily lighted up his face and his terrible countenance. What words of moment were to have fallen from his lips were never spoken, as just then a young warrior, evidently sensing the trend of thought among the older men, leaped down from the steps of the rostrum, and striking the frail captive a powerful blow across the face, which felled her to the floor, placed his foot upon her prostrate form, and, turning toward the assembled council, broke into peals of horrid, mirthless laughter. Or the Martians laying down fat beats. Did I miss something being in a fun meter? Fair enough. For an instant, I thought the Tarkus would strike him dead, nor did the aspect of Lorquas Tomel augur any too favorable. Try that again. For an instant, I thought Tarkus would strike him dead, nor did the aspect of Lorquas Tomel augur any too favorably for the brute. But the mood passed, their old selves reasserted their ascendancy, and they smiled. It was portentous, however, that they did not laugh aloud, for the brute's act constituted a side-splitting witticism, according to the ethics which rule green Martian humor. But I've taken moments to write down a good part of what occurred as that blow fell does not signify that I've remained inactive for any such length of time. I think I must have sensed something of what was coming, for I now realized that I was crouched as for a spring as I saw the blow aimed at her beautiful, upturned, pleading face, and ere the hand descended, I was halfway across the hall. Scarcely had his hideous laugh rang out but once when I was upon him. The brute was 12 feet in height and armed to the teeth, but I believe that I could have accounted for the whole roomful in the terrific intensity of my rage. Springing upward, I struck him full in the face as he turned at my warning cry, and as he drew his short sword, I drew mine and sprang up again upon his chest, hooking one leg over the butt of his pistol, and grasping one of his huge tusks with my left hand, while I delivered blow after blow upon his enormous chest. He could not use his short sword to advantage. I was too close to him, nor could he draw his pistol, which he attempted to do in direct opposition to Martian custom, which says you may not fight a fellow warrior in private combat with any other than the weapon with which you are attacked. In fact, he could do nothing but make a wild and futile attempt to dislodge me. With all his immense bulk, he was little, if any, stronger than I, and it was but the matter of a moment or two before he sank, bleeding and lifeless, to the floor. Dejah Thoris had raised herself upon one elbow and was watching the battle with wide, staring eyes. When I had regained my feet, I raised her in my arms and bore her to one of the benches at the side of the room. Again, no Martian interfered with me, and tearing a piece of silk from my cape, I endeavored to staunch the flow of blood from her nostrils. I was soon successful, as her injuries amounted to little more than an ordinary nosebleed, and when she could speak, she placed her hand upon my arm and, looking up into my eyes, said, "Why did you do it?" You who refused me even friendly recognition in the first hour of my peril. Now you risk your life and kill one of your companions for my sake. I cannot understand. What strange manner of man are you? You consort with a green man, though your form is that of my race. Your color is little darker than that of the white ape. Tell me, are you human, or are you more than human?
It's a strange tale, too long to attempt to tell you now, and one which I so much doubt the credibility of myself that I fear to hope that others will believe it. Suffice it for the present that I am your friend, and so far as our captors will permit, your protector and your servant.
And you too are a prisoner? Why then, those arms and the regalia of a Tharkian chieftain? What's your name? Where is your country?
Yes, Deja Thoris, I too am a prisoner. My name is John Carter. I claim Virginia, one of the United States of America, on Earth, as my home. Why I am permitted to wear arms that I do not know, nor was I aware that my regalia was that of a chieftain. We were interrupted at this juncture by the approach of one of the warriors, bearing arms, accoutrements, and ornaments. In a flash, one of her questions was answered, and a puzzle cleared up for me. I saw that the body of my dead antagonist had been stripped, and I read in the menacing yet respectful attitude of the warrior who brought me these trophies of the kill the same demeanor as that evinced by the other who had brought me my original equipment. And now, for the first time, I realized my blow on the occasion of the first battle in the audience chamber had resulted in the death of my adversary. The reason for the whole attitude displayed toward me was now apparent. I'd won my spurs, so to speak, and in the crude justice which always marks Martian dealings, and which, among other things, has caused me to call her the planet of paradoxes, I was awarded the honors due a conqueror, the trappings and the position of the man I killed. In truth, I was a Martian chieftain, and this, I learned later, was the cause of my great freedom and my toleration in the audience chamber. As I had turned to receive the dead warrior's chattels, I noticed that Tarkas and several others had pushed forward toward us, and the eyes of the former rested upon me in a most quizzical manner. Finally he addressed me.
You speak the tongue of Barsoom quite readily for one who was deaf and dumb to us a few short days ago. Where did you learn it, John Carter?
You yourself are responsible, Tarkas, in that you furnished me with an instructress of remarkable ability. I have to thank Sola for my learning.
She has done well, but your education in other respects needs considerable polish. Do you know what your unprecedented temerity would have cost you had you failed to kill either of the two chieftains whose medal you now wear? I presume the one whom I had failed to kill would have killed me, I answered with a smile on my face. No, you are wrong. Only in the last extremity of self-defense would a Martian warrior kill a prisoner. We like to save them for other purposes.
His face bespoke possibilities that were not pleasant to dwell upon.
But one thing can save you now. Should you, in recognition of your remarkable valor, ferocity, and prowess, be considered by Tal Hajus as worthy of his service, you may be taken into the community and become a full-fledged Tharkian. Until we reach the headquarters of Thal Hajus, it is the will of Loquas Tombel that you be accorded the respect your acts have earned you. You'll be treated by us as a Tharkian chieftain, but you must not forget that every chief who ranks you is responsible for your safe delivery to our mighty and most ferocious ruler. I'm done.
I hear you, Tarkas. As you know, I'm not of Barsoom. Your ways are not my ways, and I can only act in the future, as I have in the past, in accordance with the dictates of my conscience, guided by the standards of my own people. If you leave me alone, I will go in peace, but if not, let the individual Barsoomians with whom I must deal either respect my rights as a stranger among you, or take whatever consequences may befall. Of one thing let us be sure, whatever may be your ultimate intentions toward this unfortunate young woman, whoever would offer her injury or insult in the future must figure on making a full accounting to me. I understand that you belittle all sentiments of generosity and kindliness, but I do not. then I can convince your most doughty warrior that these characteristics are not incompatible with an ability to fight. Ordinarily, I'm not given to long speeches, nor ever before had I descended to bombast, but I had guessed at the keynote which would strike an answering chord in the chests of the Green Martians. Nor was I wrong, for my harangue evidently deeply impressed them, and their attitude toward me thereafter was still further respectful. Tarstarchus himself seemed pleased with my reply, but his only comment was more or less enigmatical.
And I think I know Talhajus Yadakathok.
I now turned my attention to Deja Thoris, and assisting her to her feet, I turned with her toward the exit, ignoring her hovering guardian harpies, as well as the inquiring glances of the chieftains. Was I not now a chieftain also? Well then, I would assume the responsibilities of one. They did not molest us, and so Deja Thoris, Princess of Helium, and John Carter, Gentleman of Virginia, followed by the faithful Rula, passed through utter silence from the audience chamber of Loquas Tomel, or Loquas Tomel Jed among the Tharks of Barsoom. Okay, folks. As much as I want to do one more chapter, I can feel my throat getting a little miffed with me about certain character voices. I'll push next week so we get a little farther. This is really, really good. Like, I was like, okay, yeah, this is kind of nice. It's interesting. We're diving into the intricacies of Martian whatnot. And then, like, and then Carter learns, then Carter learns to speak Barsoomian, and we're all like, now there's dialogue, an actual character intrigue instead of just setup. As much as I want to read more. That'll be next week. Before I forget, I almost forgot. I was going to say something right after the intermission, but I didn't. The Codex exists. That's that little bug above my head. It is a group of reading streamers, much like me. We all kind of settle into our own genres. For example, RNL Quendy has been doing a lot of visual novel work, a lot of mobile apps type stuff, which I tune in when I can. Very fun stuff. Gariki does a lot of a bug. Yeah, I've been calling that a bug. It's a logo. I guess it wouldn't technically be a bug because it's not like the patch was more akin to a bug, I guess. But either way, there's a logo above my head. There is a bug above my head. There's been a fly swirling around right up here, just off camera, all night. It's been driving me crazy. But that's not related to Codex. Agree does Agree does like kind of folk tales, that kind of thing. Atkinson does a lot of author permission stuff. As well as Jubilee OB, I believe, does a lot of author permission stuff. Long story short, we do a big, wide variety as a group of stories. Somebody was doing the Yellow King recently. Who was that? I think that was the one that plays a lot of like Destiny and stuff that I don't particularly want to watch, so that I miss their reading streams. Sorry to be so candid about that. Who is it? But that's the way it is. Who was doing Yellow King recently? Let me look. This is gonna bother me if I don't look it up right now. Winter Muting, thank you. Thank you, text chat that I was looking at. Winter Muting was doing Yellow King recently. I was very tempted to do Yellow King myself. Unfortunately, LT, you have strolled in right at the tail end of the stream. Anyway, long story short, there's a Discord full of people that also read stream. We do a book club once a month. I have some books I would like to submit for a November book club. And I need to post about that in chat sometime soon, because I found a couple books lately that I'm like, I want to see what the book club says about this. They're not exactly like as academic as say like Ender's Game or Flowers for Algernon, but I think they have some depth to them that's worth talking about.
We should also consider what we're doing for December. Come to think of it, we should
Find a good Christmas story that we can all read. I think it'd be really fun if we could put together another we read lines from a Christmas play, because we did a Christmas Carol last Christmas, and I didn't get on that train last time, and I miffed about it. That would have been fun. So we should find something like that. That would be super fun. Anyway, Codex exists. It's great. Doesn't need to be a masterpiece or academic to have a hearty discussion.
exactly. I have a bunch of books that I'm like, ooh, well, it's like there's still meat to discuss on those bones. But Altier, I really appreciate you dropping by. I know you're normally working at this hour, and so like it's very difficult for you to drop by. But I appreciate the attempt. I appreciate the effort. Um, what else? I got other stuff to promote, don't I?
While I'm yammering about things. Oh, you did a short story. Fair. What was it? I had something in my brain. Mondays. We're probably gonna be playing more one shot. I started in on one shot last Monday, or not Monday, Monday before last, because I had that week off. But we'll be back next Monday. Next Monday with one shot. I'm home and vibrating into the floor. That is frustrating, my guy. I do not envy you your oscillations. It might actually not be Monday. It might be Tuesday. We'll see. Keep an eye on my Twitter. Keep an eye on my Discord. Keep an eye on my Discord. That's where I will 100% tell you when I'm going live on my Discord. Well, 99.5% tell you when I'm live on my Discord. Keep an ear out. I might be moving the Monday night stream around. We'll probably be playing one shot until I'm through with one shot, which I'll be doing my best to capture all of the stuff that happens with one shot. Once we're done with one shot, I have a few more solo tabletop RPGs that I've been looking into. Not the least of which being Bumbling, where you play as a bee kind of wandering around a little hex map. I've been meaning to do that one for a while. Some people pay extra for that. They don't pay Altier for it. What was I gonna say? More of this next Friday. Keep one eye on the YouTube channel. I want to make some progress on it. Podcast feed. If you like what I did here tonight, there's a podcast where you just listen to me talk. We're currently on Dracula in the podcast. The podcast kind of has a weird sort of time-shifted relationship with this. We're currently on Dracula on the podcast. I did some really interesting sound work for the phonograph sections of Dracula, and I continue to do that. And I've been trying to put a little more chutzpah into Dracula in general, because it's a very popular book that I really liked, and it gives me a lot of room for auditory whatnot. So definitely keep an eye on the podcast. Anything else to promote? I haven't been writing anything lately, so there's not really anything to plug there. Keep an eye on the YouTube. In addition to those VODs, I might be trying to do some shorts? Question mark? We'll see. Those are on the back burner. We'll get to those. What else? I might be doing some basic videos, or they won't be basic videos, but there'll be basic information in the videos about my D&D setting, because that game kind of fizzled itself out due to scheduling issues, and so I'm comfortable talking a little bit about the setting to the internet at large. I'm working on anything else interesting. I've got some fun stuff on the back burner. I'm trying some new, wildly overcomplicated CSS stuff. I just learned that you might be able to use displacement maps in CSS, which unlocks like this wild volume of crazy like
video game style texturing techniques, which if that works, it's very computationally intensive, so it's not very useful in like an actual website environment, but like if it actually works, I might be able to pull out some really cool stuff for my stream layouts. I might be able to like animate certain displacement maps on certain things on this screen and some of my other screens. Long story short, I'm working on a lot of fun stuff, but the things that you get to see so far are on Fridays and a different arbitrary day of the week that was originally Monday and might not continue to be Monday. But we're reading on Fridays and we'll be playing a video game a different day of the week. Promise. And keep one eye on YouTube because there's fun stuff there. In a nutshell. Anyway. This has been Paper Cuts. I've rattled on too long. This has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't stay.